All right, everyone. Hello and welcome back. I hope everyone had a fantastic weekend, had a few days to kind of stretch and take a breather here, kind of think about everything that we learned in the first week, airspace, and everything else in between. As you can kind of tell, what I said on day one was that ground schools are a great opportunity before you even start flying in the airplane. You can imagine that even if you made it for the first 3 days of class, you're going to be far more prepared going into your first flight lesson than if you just showed up to the airport and you didn't know some of that basic information. So once again, we looked at aerodynamics, how an airplane flies. We looked at aircraft systems, the basics of how engines operate and the intake through the actual carbureted system, through the actual exhaust. We also looked at your flight instruments, which we finished up last week as well. So you have a basic idea of what you're going to be looking at and what each of the instruments does. We had an opportunity to see what you're going to find on maps and also to start taking a look at airspace as well. So just those first 3 lessons makes you more prepared than the average student walking into a flight school on day 1. And imagine if you just keep this up for 3 more weeks and you're done and you take your written test and you get the endorsement, you actually take the official test, you're going to be far more ahead than most students basically starting their lessons as well. All right. So great job, everybody. I know this stuff can be a bit difficult at times, and this is just where it takes practice. And I promise you the pieces of the puzzle will start to be fit together. But feel free to continue asking questions. And like I said before, a lot of the lessons that we're going to be talking about really build upon each other. So we may have talked about airspace for one lesson, but I guarantee you airspace will come up in future lessons as well as we start to kind of put the building blocks or the pieces of the puzzle together to kind of give you a more complete view of the National Airspace System and what we're actually supposed to be using, or how do we actually use these things on a practical day-to-day basis. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look on what is on the agenda for today. Today is class number 4. As I said before, we still have some wrap up that we have to do. So remember, anything that we don't finish in the previous lesson, we're going to go ahead and do in today's lesson. So where we left off, and most of our classes out there, we have 4 different classes, and all the classes are actually plus or minus about 5 to 10 minutes. So everybody's pretty much in line where we want them to be. So if you might have a friend taking a different class, they might be a little bit ahead or a little bit behind, just depends on which class they're currently taking. But what we're going to be doing is we are moving into week number 2. So you're officially more than 25% of the way done with the course. It's amazing how fast these classes fly by. And first thing we're going to do is we're going to finish up our airspace lesson. So we talked about some of the basics of airspace, the differences between controlled airspace and non-controlled airspace. We also talked about class Gulf airspace. We talked about class Echo airspace, and we talked about class Alpha airspace as well. The next sets of airspace are going to be all of our towered airports for Delta, Charlie, and Bravo airports. And we're going to be talking about SUA, which is special use airspace. We'll basically wrap up that section before we continue pressing on with the new material. So that's probably going to take us through our first hour. And then my guess is we'll switch gears probably after the first break, and we'll start moving into the Federal Aviation Regulations. So these are known as FARs, and we're really going to pay attention to 3 primary areas. There are a lot more FARs out there, but these are really the only ones that they're going to test you on for your knowledge test as well. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at some basic definitions before we get started, which is known as in section part 1. And the FAA definitions out there, these are things like what does pilot in command mean? What is the definition of nighttime? And those types of things that we need to know in order to understand the actual way that the regulations are written down the road. Then we're going to look at part 61, which is basically your licensing requirements, and we're going to specifically pay attention to our student and our private pilot privileges and limitations. Student pilots have a certain set of limitations and privileges in terms of what they can do and what they can't do. Once you graduate to the private pilot world, you get a few more privileges thrown in there as well and less limitations. And this is also where we typically find the medical information. And if you wanted to know about how to get an instrument rating or a commercial rating or any of the other licenses, certificates, or ratings available to you, you'd actually look in part 61 of the Federal Aviation Regulations. And then we'll switch gears for the final time and we'll look at the VFR flight rules, which stands for Visual Flight Rules, in part 91. And this is where we're going to spend the bulk of our time today. We will definitely not finish up the Federal Aviation Regulations. So wherever we end up stopping in the VFR flight rule section, we'll basically pick up in our future classes. And keep in mind at that point, just for the rest of the week, for if you're planning ahead, we'll basically finish up Federal Aviation Regulations, and then the next two class periods are going to be on Airport Operations Part 1 and Airport Operations basically Part 2. We break up those classes because it's a lot of information basically about airports, and what we're going to look at in that section is we're going to look at everything from notice to air missions, which used to be notice to airmen. We'll be looking at how to actually taxi in and around an airport. We'll be looking at taxi diagrams, basically all the different signage that you're going to find in and around the airports, what you can do and what you can't do. We'll also be looking at how runways are designed, same thing with taxiways. We'll also be looking at runway incursions. We'll also be looking at how to avoid runway incursions. We'll also look at how to basically navigate to or from an airport in terms of how are you actually going to enter the traffic pattern at a towered airport versus a non-towered airport, and what are the procedures and things like that, and what would you kind of expect. So that's kind of what we're going to be doing for the rest of the week moving forward. Once again, we should be able to get fully caught up where I want to be. So basically all the classes at the end of the week here, when we finish part 2 of the airport operations, we should basically all be at the same stopping place for the following week's material. And then also we have the aircraft airworthiness, which is basically we have a couple more acronyms to throw at you. We have AERO and AVIATED. AERO is basically all of our documents that need to be on board the aircraft, and AVIATED is all of our inspections that have to be complied with. And we'll go into detail about that. And probably on the next class period, we will be talking about, if you go out to an airplane and something's broken, maybe a light's not working, maybe, something's just not what it's not in the normal status. Let's put it that way. Can I legally fly or can I not? And we're going to take you through kind of this step-by-step guide. There's 7 steps actually that we have to follow in the correct order. And we'll look at those in the future as well.
All right, before we get going today, just a couple of updates here. So for most of our students in our private pilot ground school, nothing has really changed for you guys because the website that you see in front of you is actually our brand new website. But for some of our older students that have been around with us for the last couple of years, we've actually gone through 4 server upgrades over the last 3 years, actually. Just because of the amount of growth that we have. So things might appear a little bit different, but I just want to kind of point out a few things to all of our students here. When you log into the homepage, some students are asking, where is the news feed? Where do I find Ask an Instructor? It is actually on the homepage. If you were to click anywhere on the Check Ride Prep logo in the upper left-hand corner, it does take you back to the homepage. Majority of you are actually sitting in the free Private Pilot Ground School GS17 here below that. But just as a reminder, you can actually click on any one of these links. The newsfeed is going to be basically the primary home of the Check Ride Prep community. This acts just like our old newsfeed does. And in here, you can correspond with our team of instructors, moderators, or other students as well. You can find any of the posts that we put in here, and we typically put posts depending on whatever we're going to be covering, depending on the class that we're covering as well. So you can always just click the See More button. You can add your own comments or 2 cents. We have a pitot-static instruments from the other day when we covered that information. If you go to the very top portion, on the left-hand side, you can see any of our upcoming events for future classes. We're already in the news feed. If we have announcements, we'll place them here. The student's introduction, I would encourage you guys to check this out and reach out to your fellow students, let them know, what brought you in. And just like we did on the first day, see if you can form a group with other students to kind of study the materials with. That's usually a very successful strategy at the end of the day. Ask an instructor. This is where this lives, or this portion of the website lives. So if you do have any questions that is anything aviation related, not really admin related, you can go ahead and put it in here. Just go ahead and put it in, and we typically take a look at these about 2 or 3 times per day. We've also uploaded a number of our older questions from students that we think that would pertain to everyone. So just as a reminder, if you have any aviation specific questions, maybe something wasn't answered by the moderator in class, this is a perfect example of basically where to find this information. All right. So that basically wraps up the Check Ride Prep community. So for the majority of you, this looks exactly as you probably saw it the first time. There are a number of students that have taken our classes multiple times, so it's great to have you guys take a look at our new platform and hop on board the migration, which is just about wrapped up here. And finally, before we get to today's course materials, we'll always cover this information. What is the catch? Hopefully by now we are moving into week number 2. There is no catch for this class. You guys have access to the live streams, the recordings in multiple different locations. You have access to the documents, the handouts, the quizzes, the tests, the final exam, and also the written test endorsement. We don't charge for any of this. So as I've said from day one, we've tried to make this open to as many people as possible. We've had over 100,000 students sit and enroll in our courses, and it's completely doable to basically go from 0 to hero here and walk away with your written test endorsement, in hand without paying anything, and that's really the goal. Everybody who started with us on day one, we want you to end with us by the end of class. That being said, if you want to call it a catch, the only thing that we will do is we will terminate the free access at the end of class. So our very, very last day of class is going to be Friday, October 14th. And we give you an additional 5 days to wrap up any outstanding lessons and also to take the final exam. So just as a reminder, in order to get your written test endorsement, all you need to do is watch all 12 of the lessons. Does not matter whether they're live or recorded. It also does not matter whether they are on YouTube or Facebook or on our platform here, the Learning Portal on the Check Ride Prep website. You can mix and match to your heart's delight. That last day of class on Friday, October 14th, that is when the final exam becomes available to all students. And it's a total of 60 questions. You have a total of 2.5 hours to complete it. We do our best to mimic the FAA exam, and you just need to get an 80% or higher. You'll have unlimited attempts to pass it, so don't worry about that. I've seen students take this exam, on upwards of 20 to 25 times in a 5-day period. Everybody seems to have enough time to get everything wrapped up. So once again, 5 days after our last date of class will put us on Wednesday, October 19th, and that'll be at 12 p.m. Pacific Coast time is when we terminate the access. The reason why we do it is it gives us a higher completion rate. Right now, we're just shy of 96%. We're right at 95.5%-ish. And if we left the course open year round, we would not see numbers as high as we are, as we currently have today. So, this is the reason why we're doing it. As I've said before, we're holding your feet to the fire. We want you and encourage you to finish it. We're here to help you. So let us know if there's any questions that we can answer along the way to make this as hopefully fun and simple as possible. And then finally, my little public service announcement. Just as a reminder, in the event that you do feel like you're going to need more time or you like the way that we teach, we do have the Check Ride Prep Private Pilot Lifetime Membership available. It was on sale all of last week. The sale will continue, but at a higher price now. So it is $169 or 3 payments of $57. We brought back in the payment system to try to make it as affordable as possible for people. This gives you not only access, obviously, to the private pilot ground school, you also have access besides just the live streams that you guys watch for free. We actually professionally record each one of our classes in a studio environment. There are no breaks. We basically break up the lessons. So instead of watching 12 3.5-hour lessons, it's more like watching 50 to 60 to sometimes 70 mini lessons, depending on the course. In addition to that, you have, up-to-date information. We're always ensuring that the federal aviation regulations are up to date, and any other changes that the FAA imposes are actually seen throughout the courses. You have unlimited practice quizzes and exams. I believe there's just shy of about 900 FAA-like test questions that we've uploaded for you. And the nice thing about our system is every time you guys take a quiz or a test, it does basically jumble the test questions so they don't ever look alike to try to, so that way you don't get into a habit of, let's say, memorizing the test question and the answer. You also have instructor support from our team of instructors and customer service here 24/7. You'll be able to get the FAA written test endorsement beyond the date that I mentioned previously. You can also get FAA Wings credits as well. You'll have access to all the past webinars. We do live seminars and Q&As typically once a month. You'll be invited to those as well. And in addition to that, we have a couple bonuses. So the Private Pilot Flight Maneuvers course, these are all of the FAA flight maneuvers that you'll be required to learn. So this is basically putting into practice how to actually fly these step by step, look at the requirements, look at some of the common student errors that the FAA has identified, and so forth. And you'll also have access to the Private Pilot Companion Guide, which is our PDF version, which includes all the handouts and notes section, the FAA testing supplement. It also includes 120 pages of course notes done by instructors that have watched this course end to end. So the other benefit here too, like I've always said with this, is that you might finish your private pilot now, and it might be a year before you're ready to sit for your check ride. When you're preparing for your check ride, it's nice to be able to review some of the material that you may have found that you have a little bit of knowledge gaps in as well. So this is a perfect opportunity to do that. And you also support our mission, which is basically to provide these types of free courses ongoing to the public indefinitely. And it's really the few who pay for the many. It's the few folks who have allowed us to serve over 100,000 students from all walks of life, all ages, from majority in the United States, but also elsewhere around the world. So with that, that is it. That is my public service announcement. Let's go ahead and move on to today's material.
All right, so let's go back to our airspace. This is kind of where we left off. We all should have a drawing that looks something like this. This is your Airspace Triangle, and we did include a bunch of the blank ones that you can download and print out. And this is basically covering all the weather requirements to go in and out of the airspace. So remember, the apex or the very top of the triangle is class alpha, which starts at 18,000 MSL and above. And then we went through each of the airspaces with all of the weather requirements, and the ones you kind of want to commit to memory is anything above 10,000 feet, which is basically representing this line right here. We use the F111, which is 5 statute miles of visibility, 1,000 above, 1,000 below, and 1 statute mile horizontally. If you're below 10,000 feet, you're more likely to see 3 Cessna 152s. A Cessna 152 is basically a 2-seater aircraft, and that basically is 3 statute miles of visibility, 1,000 above, 500 below, and 2,000 feet horizontally. My banana off the left is representing the moon for class Golf from surface to 10,000, which will revert at nighttime to the center or the upside down triangle. And then we also had class Golf, which was basically from surface to 1,200 at 1 statute mile. COC is clear of clouds. And then from 1,200 feet to 10,000 feet during the day, it was 1 statute mile of visibility, 1,000 above, 500 below, and 2,000 feet horizontally. The only other one that we threw outside here was class Bravo, which is 3 statute miles clear of clouds. And you guys can come up with whatever mnemonics you like. I had a student who liked Coca-Cola a lot, so traditionally, if they were talking about class Golf during the day, they said, I'm more likely to knock over 1 Coke machine. COC, Coke machine is the way they remembered it, because it's not very busy airspace. And if I'm in class Bravo, I'm more likely to knock over 3 Coke machines. So use whatever analogies you want, Coke, donuts, or anything else in between. And what I would recommend you guys do is, number 1, first identify the airspace. Then number 2, once you're good with that, then start drawing out this chart. If you can draw out this chart about 10 times from memory, you guys will have this fully committed to your memory, okay? All right. So here is class Delta. This is the last thing that we talked about before we left on Friday. So just kind of refresh your memory. Class Delta traditionally has an average radius, and it's usually going to be 4 nautical miles. And it's up to, from surface to 2,500 feet. AGL is the normal dimensions. Keep in mind that those dimensions are going to change depending on the airport location and the circumstances. So the one that I gave you guys was Camarillo, California, which is right here. And the blue dashed line that we can kind of see, or the blue cyan line, I'll use the appropriate terminology here. This right here is basically the boundary of the class Delta, and we can clearly see there's another class Delta to the south of Camarillo as well. Your dead giveaway is anything with a box with a number in it. So there's actually 2 class Deltas basically side by side in this location. There's actually 3. There's one that's missing from the chart here. But your dead giveaway for a class Delta is a box with a number in it. And basically what that's representing in this case is basically from surface to 2000. It will tell you the ceiling of the class Delta. So Camarillo's class Delta goes from surface to 2000. Point Mugu, which is kind of off at the very bottom here, is surface to 3000. Occasionally you might see something with a minus sign in it. So if it says -20, that means that it basically is going to be from the surface up to, but not including 2,000 feet. So that's going to be 1999 MSL versus this would be surface to 2,000 feet MSL without a minus. Okay, so the negative sign, if you see that in front of that, that basically means it's up to, but excluding whatever that value is. Okay, mainly because we cannot have 2 different airspaces that overlap with each other. Doesn't work in that regard. Now, the other thing that you'll also notice that we pointed out is that if we look at the title here, we've got Camarillo, California, and we have a control tower. The frequency is 128.2, and you're going to notice there's this star here, and that star basically is telling you that there's some type of operational limitation that exists. And some towered airports, they do have a control tower, but they're not necessarily staffed 24 hours a day. You'll also notice in the upper corner here, it's going to say see NOTAM supplement. NOTAM is a notice to airmen, and the supplement is your chart supplement for class Delta and Echo surface effective hours. So just out of general knowledge, because I fly out of Camarillo, the tower usually is open from 7 a.m. local to about 9 p.m. And then after that, it will revert to a different type of airspace, and it will usually revert to either class Echo or class Golf. Now, where we find this information, and we'll talk more about the chart supplement on Wednesday, is there's this document called the chart supplement. This was formerly known as the Airport Facility Directory, the AFD, for any of our older pilots out there. And it would basically cover a large geographic area. In this case, we're using the Southwest U.S. Version. And you can see this covers California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado. Very simply, we'd go and look up the information for Camarillo. So we'd go to the California section of the chart supplement. We'd then go alphabetically to C for Camarillo. And we'll talk more about how to read these on Wednesday, but the section that I want you guys to pay attention to here is number 2. Number 2 is specifically talking about the airspace, and what it's telling you is class Delta is service from 1500 to 0500 Zulu. At all other times, it is class Golf. So the way that we convert Zulu, by the way, is very simply, you can do it off of your phone, or you can actually go to the very, very top here where it says UTC -8 or -7 for daylight time. So what you would do is you'd figure out, are we in daylight savings time or not? And we would figure out, we would basically subtract either 7 or 8 from the Zulu time at the bottom, and that would give us the local military time for Camarillo. And then we can basically figure out from there, is the tower open or closed? So that's roughly going to be about 7 a.m. to roughly 9 p.m. local. And that class Delta, even though the chart is not going to change here, basically anytime between 9 p.m. at night to 7 a.m., just before 7 a.m. in the morning, this is actually all going to be class Golf within this airspace because the tower is closed, which means that the weather requirements are going to change, your communication requirements are going to change, and so forth. The other thing that we also want to talk about is anytime you go into a class Delta, before you penetrate the airspace, so you need to basically have permission to go into that airspace. So assuming that the tower is open, you need them to basically tell you, or what we would say, establish two-way radio communication. So to establish two-way radio communication, you basically need to call up the tower, whether you're taking off or you're coming into the airspace, and you just need to have them acknowledge you and your call sign. So very simply, if I'm going to be flying in from, let's say over here, which is the east, and I am going to be, let's say I am Cessna 1234, 1234, that's my November 1234. All I need to do is basically say Camarillo Towers, Cessna 1234. I'm about 10 miles to the east inbound with Victor for a landing. And as long as they say Cessna 1234, continue, that's fine. Cessna 1234, you know what, number 2 straight in, you know, landing runway 26, clear to land. Those are all going to be considered establishing two-way radio communication. Now, if they say Cessna 1234 standby, that is also considered established radio communication. Now, if they say Cessna 1243 because they get my call sign wrong, that is not going to be established. So you just need them to basically repeat your call sign. Unless they tell you explicitly to stay out of their airspace, then you are going to be deemed to be established, or basically establishing that two-way radio communication as long as they say your call sign. But if they say Cambrio Tower, Cessna, or let's say it's Cessna 1234, Cambrio Tower, I need you to stay clear of my airspace. Call back in 5 minutes. At that point, they're giving you an explicit instruction to basically not continue or penetrate their airspace. Okay? So that is what is known as establishing two-way radio communication. The other places that we can find the information is there is a tower frequency. If you were to open up your chart, any of your charts, whether you're looking at your sectional or your TAC chart, somewhere along the edges, they will have all of the information for the tower frequencies. It will let you know their hours of operation. It will also give you the tower frequency, the ground control, ATIS, which we'll talk about a little bit more, and the hours as well. So those are all included on there, even though you're going to find it right next to the airport as well. So that is basically Class Delta in a nutshell. Class Delta, for the most part, it's not going to remain Class Delta indefinitely, meaning that the tower is usually not in operation 24/7. Very rarely does that occur. Even at the busiest general aviation airport in the world, which is Van Nuys, that also closes, I believe, around 10 p.m. local time. So Class Delta airspace, just remember, it's going to be surrounded by that blue cyan dashed line, and then your dead giveaway for Class Delta, as I said before, is going to be that box with the number in it. So here for the Eugene Sweet Airport up in Oregon, the Class Delta goes from the surface up to 2,900 feet. We know that it's a towered airport because remember the color coding of the airport, that cyan color means that there's a control tower. But also, if we were to look at these stars here, we know that the control tower is not open 24 hours a day. So we would check that green book and basically confirm if it is what it's going to revert to. It's either going to revert to a Class Echo or Golf, and it will also give us the hours of operation as well, right? So remember that anytime you're flying within here, going back to our Airspace Triangle, this is the 3152. This is the Class Delta right here, and that's your 3 statute miles of visibility, 1,000 above, 500 below, and 2,000 feet horizontally. All right, so let's go to our very first FAA test question. Please remember that when you're answering the test question, do not put the answer in the chat. Go ahead and just answer in the poll. It's going to be right below the chat. If you're on YouTube or Facebook, just take a mental note or write it down on a separate piece of paper. When a control tower located on an airport within Class Delta airspace ceases operation for the day, what happens to the airspace designation? Is it A, the airspace designation normally will not change? B, the airspace remains Class Delta as long as a weather observer or automated weather system is available? Or C, the airspace reverts to Class Echo or a combination of Class Echo and Golf airspace during the hours the tower is not in operation? Got the first third of the class in. Thanks again for not answering in the chat. Do appreciate that. Is that what all those squiggles are that you guys have next to your name? Is that supposed to be a smiley face? Because that doesn't show up on my end. I just see like dots and weird fingers pointing to the left. All right, got about 60% of the class in. All right, glad I'm not the only one, Brian, that's not seeing the smiley faces there. About 80% of the class. Give you guys a couple extra seconds here. Usually takes you guys a little bit to warm up to the vote function, and then you guys are pretty quick moving forward. So just 2 airspaces after this, we're basically going to cover Class Charlie and then Class Bravo, and then we'll move on to special use and we'll wrap this thing up here. All right, apologize if I cut off anybody. We got majority of the class in. We've got about 4% with A, 8% with B, and the majority of the class over 86% with the correct answer, which is going to be C. So remember that a Class Delta airspace is going to surround airports that have some type of operational control towers. So Class D airspace is going to revert to either Class Echo airspace or Class Gulf airspace. And it could be potentially a combination. So that's the reason why C is correct. And where we find this information is in the chart supplement, which is that green book. And like I said, we'll show you guys exactly how to see that and how to actually read that document on Wednesday. All right, moving on to Class Charlie. Class Charlie looks like a simple upside down wedding cake. It always has 2 layers. There is a inner layer that has a radius of approximately 5 nautical miles, which basically goes from the surface to roughly about 1,200 feet, just depends on the actual airport. And then the outer layer is going to extend up to 10 nautical mile radius. And like I said, just looks like an upside down wedding cake. Traditionally, the maximum altitude is going to be 4,000 feet AGL, so 4,000 feet above whatever the primary airport location is. Now, they're not necessarily all going to be perfectly circular like this. If you're in the Midwest and there's really no obstacles, then you'll probably see them nice and circular. Depending on where you're located, they might be staggered with different layers in them. So, for example, Beale's Class Charlie airspace, or the one that I'm going to show you, which is going to be the Santa Barbara Class Charlie. Now, the way that we can identify a Class Charlie is very, very simple. It's a solid magenta line. It's that solid reddish line that you can see there. And that is your Class Charlie. The other thing, too, is what's really cool about a Class Charlie and a Class Bravo. In case you forget, it is dead clear in terms of who owns the Class Charlie. So this happens to be Santa Barbara Class Charlie. So if you're ever confused with any of the solid lines, just kind of look to the edges of that airspace and you'll usually see it. Whoever does the maps for the FAA, they just put them these names, Santa Barbara Class Charlie, wherever they have room. So they're not always going to be on the right, the left. They could be really anywhere around it. Now you'll notice Santa Barbara is a little bit different. It's kind of like a half circle when we look at it. The main reason why is that we have this mountain range, which pretty much effectively protects Santa Barbara, because it's 4,000 feet high. Really, you're not going to have many people going in from coming in from the north to the south. Now, the way that this works is the inner ring is from surface to 4,000. SFC is always going to be surface. And you're always going to basically have the highest value of 4 and then whatever the lowest value is here. So that inner ring is from surface to 4,000. Now, the outer ring is pretty simple. That's going to be from 1,500 feet to 4,000. And depending on where you are within that outer ring, if I'm potentially at a boat at the Golette intersection, which is a GPS point right here to the south, then from the surface of the ocean up to basically right before 1,500, up to but not including 1,500, or in this case up to 1,200 AGL would be Class Gulf. And then from 1,200 up to but not including 1,500 would be Class Echo. And then from 1,500 to 4,000 would be Class Charlie. And everything above that would be Class Echo again. So you kind of have to play games and figure out where are you sitting. We can clearly see if my boat was right on Victor 27 here, then because of the magenta shade, I would actually be on Class Gulf from surface to 700, and then from 700 up to but not including 1,500 would be Class Echo, and then from 1,500 to 4,000 would be Class Charlie, and then it would be Echo above that. If I move my boat right here, within that dash line, remember the magenta dash line is basically the equivalent of Class Echo starting at the surface. In that case, that is Class Echo from surface up to but not including 1,500. And then we've got 1,500 to 4,000. And then everything above that will be Class Echo again. So Santa Barbara is easy. Anytime that you're flying into a Class Charlie, you do need to basically establish two-way radio communication. They will usually have an approach departure frequency. So here, depending on which direction you're coming from, we can clearly see that it will say contact Santa Barbara approach within 20 nautical miles. And there's actually two different frequencies here. So for us, we're going to use the 25.4 frequency. The 291.1 is for ultra high frequency. That's traditionally going to be the military. You'll notice that that's coming from the east. If you're coming from the west side of the airport, they're going to give you a different frequency because they basically split the operation in half, where basically if you're coming from one side, you're going to use 125.4. If you're coming from the west side, you're going to use 120.55. We're going to get more into radio communications and operations once we move forward. Okay. The other one that we have is, this is another example of basically the Grand Rapids area. So this is General Ford International Airport. So we have two rings, an inner ring and an outer ring. This one is from surface to 4,800. And then the outer ring, the entire outer ring, is from 2,000 to 4,800. This has the same requirements as what we just talked about with Class Delta. So for Class Charlie, it's still the 3,152, so 3 statute miles of visibility, 1,000 feet above, 500 feet below, and 2,000 feet horizontally. So it's that center part of the triangle, right? All right, let's test your knowledge with the potential vertical limits of your Class Charlie primary airport. So let me pull this one up. The vertical limit of Class Charlie airspace above the primary airport. What we mean by the primary airport is, remember, there's an inner ring and the outer ring. We don't care about the outer wing. We want to know what is the normal vertical limit of the inner ring. Is it going to be 1,200 feet AGL, 3,000 feet AGL, or 4,000 feet AGL? First third of the class in. I forgot to remind you guys, for anybody that purchased between Monday of last week to Monday of this week, we are doing that drawing later tonight. So you don't have to be around. We typically will just draw the names or have Travis draw the names for us randomly. I think I've got about 4 or 5 FAR aims to give out for the 2022 version. I've got a bunch of E6Bs I'm trying to get off my desk, and also the plotters. And I think I've got 2 Rod Machado books to give away. So I will let you guys know the names. If you win, we'll send you an email to everybody, and we'll just send it to your billing address on file. And then we'll also let everybody know on Wednesday as well. Got about 80% of the class in, just waiting for a few other stragglers here. And I'll take anything, I like it. Well, bribe Travis, not me. All right, let's take a look at it. We got 25% of the class with A, 8% with B, and majority of 65% of the class plus with C. So the correct answer is C. It is 4,000 feet. Basically, it depends. Remember, this is AGL, above ground level. So traditionally, that inner ring, depending on wherever that airport is located, the height, or the vertical height of this, is roughly 4,000 feet tall. Okay, and then you're just gonna have to figure out, depending on where it's located. Obviously, if it's in mountainous areas, it might have a higher value than that, but the actual height is going to be no longer or larger than 4,000 feet. All right, the last airspace is going to be your Class Bravo airspace. This is your biggest and busiest airspace. You could think of big, busy, Boeing as keywords. These do have control towers as well. For the most part, most Class Bravos out there are going to be operational 24/7. These are going to be your biggest and busiest airports in the country. So Los Angeles, San Francisco, Vegas, Phoenix, Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, Miami, all the New York airports, all the DC airports, Boston, Logan, Nashville, Chicago, Harris, Seattle, any of these. I think there's about 22 or 23 that exist around the country. And they look like upside down wedding cakes. Some of them are very simple in their design, and some of them are not necessarily going to be circular. In the Los Angeles area, we kind of have one that is not really circular. It's kind of all over the place. I don't even know what the shape of it would be. But what you'll have is different layers. It will usually go from surface up to 10,000 or 10,000 feet MSL. Now, to get into a Class Bravo, instead of having or basically being able to establish two-way radio communication, in this case, you also need to basically get a clearance to get into Class Bravo. So what you're going to do is when you call up the controller, you're basically going to ask for clearance to get into Class Bravo. And the magic words that you need to hear is your call sign. So Cessna 1234, you're cleared into the Los Angeles Class Bravo airspace. You got to hear cleared into the airspace and also your call sign. If you don't hear that, then you're not allowed to go in. So it's a little bit different than establishing two-way radio communication. This is much bigger and busier. Traditionally, you will need a transponder to go within this area. We'll talk more about transponders, but there is a test question coming up. It's called a 4096 coded transponder. Transponder is basically the way that air traffic control can see you. And the reason why we call it a 4096 coded transponder is because there's 4,096 potential unique codes that transponder can spit out. We'll get into more about the operations of that system on Wednesday. So Class Bravo is going to be at those larger airports. They're going to have multiple different ceilings and floors. Majority of them are from surface to 10,000. There are exceptions like Boston Logan. We can see the highest altitude here is up to 7,000. If you go to higher airports like Denver or Salt Lake, they actually go above 10,000 just because the airport elevation or the field elevation already is fairly high. The inner ring that we see here is going to be a solid blue is what we're looking for, and the solid blue is from surface to 7,000. We have an outer ring right here from 2 to 7,000, and then we have another ring which is from 3 to 7,000. We've got another portion right here in this corner which is 4,000 to 7,000. And then basically looks like everything else here is 4,000 to 7,000. So the way that you can identify a Class Bravo is going to be a solid blue, that solid cyan color. That is your rapid identification. So remember, Class Charlies are solid magentas, solid blues or cyans are going to be your Class Bravos. Just like we saw before, if you were to look at the edges around a Class Bravo, you will also see who owns it. So it should say somewhere around here, it should say Boston Logan Class Bravo. I believe it's cut off on the map kind of at the top here that's unshaded. The other thing that you'll also notice is there's something known as a Mode C veil. It's a 30 nautical mile basically ring that basically extends 30 nautical miles from the primary airport, which is the Boston airport right there. And it goes from the surface up to 10,000 feet. Anytime that you're flying within the ring and also within the Class Bravo, you need to have a Mode C encoding transponder. So what that means is Mode C is besides just providing a location, it's also basically going to provide an altitude to air traffic control. So you're at 5,500 feet and you're climbing. The most basic type of transponder is called a 4096 coded transponder. That just provides the location. But if you have either a Mode C transponder or a 4096 coded transponder with altitude capabilities, then it's going to provide the target, and then it will also provide the altitude to the air traffic controller as well. So that is effectively what a Mode C transponder is. And we'll talk more, like I said, about the operation of that moving forward. Now, the other thing that we'll also talk about is this is the 3 statute miles of visibility, clear of clouds. A lot of people were asking yesterday, what does that mean, clear of clouds? You just need to, you can get as close to a cloud as you want. You just can't have any part of the aircraft go into the cloud at all. Then finally, this is one where there is certain licensing requirements. For the most part, student pilots can fly into the Class Bravo airspace, but there are about 12 or 13 airports around the country where you do have to be a licensed pilot, meaning a private pilot or higher, in order to actually land at the facility. So what we mean by that is the primary airport that the Class Bravo is basically protecting, in this case, is Boston Logan. If it's on the list, and I have to go pull the list, I can tell you, like San Francisco International, LaGuardia, JFK, Los Angeles International, those are airports that a student pilot cannot land at because they are off limits. But if you are a student pilot, you have the ability to fly in and around a Class Bravo as long as you have certain endorsements from your instructor and additional training along the way as well. Okay. All right. Then finally, we have our special VFR. Remember, basic VFR is 3 statute miles of visibility and at least 1,000-foot ceiling. You're going to see this number a lot, so commit it to memory. The ceiling is the lowest of either the broken or the overcast layer, so anything less than these values is going to be considered IFR. Now, in the event that you're maybe flying, trying to get out of the airport, or if you're trying to get back into the airport, and it is going to be considered IFR at the airport, then you can do something called request a special VFR clearance. The special VFR clearance, you need to basically have 1 statute mile of visibility and remain clear of clouds. And basically what will end up happening is you want to be fairly certain that you can get either into the airport or out of the airport. It doesn't allow you to penetrate any type of clouds, but this is something that might help out, in the event that maybe a marine layer is coming in. So in the example I give you here, let's assume your airport is down there, and you can't go into any of the clouds, but if you see a gap like this, you could basically start descending early, and assuming that airport is going to be IFR, you could potentially get back into that airport. Now, just use caution when you do this as well. So keep in mind that anytime you're doing this, you don't want to do something called scud running, which is basically flying right against the layer of clouds, basically the ceiling of the clouds. And you're basically trying to fight terrain. A lot of times people get into accidents because the terrain rises rapidly and you're not paying attention. And obviously you can't go through the clouds, so you're kind of stuck. A lot of times, for the most part, sometimes it's just better to call it a day and just not fly in those conditions. The other thing as well is that at certain airports like the Camarillo airport, we are actually get a marine layer quite frequently. So if we look at this, here's basically the Pacific Ocean over here. And very simply, we have a runway right here, and the weather sensor happens to be right smack dab in the middle of the runway. A lot of times what ends up happening is that marine layer kind of comes in like this, and it's going to cover up the weather sensor, where it's going to report the conditions of basically a 900-foot ceiling, which means that the airport is now IFR. Yet, everything to the right of that squiggly line is basically going to be clear. It's clear as day, and potentially you're coming back into the airport. You could request special VFR, or maybe you're doing a big trip to Vegas and you're trying to get out of the California area, so you could request special VFR to get out, stay below 900 feet, and then basically climb over to Vegas where it's nice and sunny. So there are some exceptions, and kind of you want to be very judicious if you're going to be using special VFR. Now, the other thing with special VFR as well is that certain airports, primarily Class Bravo airports, there is no special VFR allowed because you're kind of tying up the air traffic control system. So for example, at Houston Intercontinental or Houston International Airport, we can clearly see here, this says no SVFR, which is special VFR. That's kind of enlarged here for you for that. So if you do see that at an airport, then no special VFR requests are going to be honored in that situation. Okay. Then finally, what we've got is going to be some of our VFR corridors within the Class Bravo. So anytime you're usually within Class Bravo, especially the LA area, I showed you guys all of the different ways to kind of get in and around. You'll see these arrows that go up and down, and there's actually one right here for the mini route, the coastal route. This is the Coliseum route, and I think this is called the Hollywood Park route. So we could actually look on the TAC and actually figure out how do we actually traverse the Los Angeles area, because we can't just necessarily fly anywhere we want in LA. Okay. So this is used by air traffic control to basically route VFR traffic through the Class Bravo airspace. You can find these only on your terminal area charts. The requirements for this is you do need air traffic control clearance. You have to have that Mode C transponder, which is basically a transponder that basically tells ATC your position, and it also provides altitude information. And then you have to adhere to whatever the published route is and any air traffic control instructions that they may give you. All right, so what is the minimum radio equipment? Let me open up the poll here. What minimum radio equipment is required for VFR operation within Class Bravo airspace? Is it A, two-way radio communications equipment and a 4096 coded transponder? B, a two-way radio communications equipment, a 4096 code transponder and an encoding altimeter? Or C, two-way radio communication equipment, a 4096 code transponder, an encoding altimeter, and a VOR or TACAN receiver? If you didn't hear some of any of those buzzwords, it's probably not the correct answer. Mode C and ADS-B, that is correct, Josh. We'll get more into ADS-B on Wednesday as well, Wednesday and Friday. All right, there's the first third of the class. I'm going to go a couple minutes past our normal break time just so I can finish up this lesson. So we'll probably take a break about 5 or 10 minutes past, just so I can put a knot in this one. And we're actually going to be filming the LA Special Flight Rules area, and also our plan this week at some point is we're actually going to film step-by-step for pilots how to navigate around the LA area and actually fly each one of those routes in detail. So you guys will be able to see that in future videos here, hopefully in November when we're done editing everything. All right, got about 60% of the class in. All right, a little bit of a split class here. We got about 45% with A, 49% with B, and the balance of the class with C. So anytime that we're basically operating within a class Bravo airspace, we obviously need to have a radio because we need to basically get some type of clearance to enter. So that is, a correct statement for all of these. We do need a 4096 coded transponder, but it also needs to have an encoding altimeter, right? So this 4096 coded transponder and an encoding altimeter is the requirement, and that's the reason why B is correct. You'll notice that this is just going to provide us position information, which is not correct. And if we're looking at C, the 4096 is there, the encoding transponder, or I'm sorry, the encoding altimeter. The VOR and TACAN receiver is not a requirement to be inside of your airplane, so that is also the reason why B is correct moving forward. Okay, so about a little less than, well, a little bit more than half the class got that correct in that case. All right, couple last minute things. These are going to be different special use airspace. We call these SUAs. There's a couple also remnants from the pre-1993 airspace classification system. They basically redid some of the classifications. So we have these things called TRSAs. These are Terminal Radar Service Advisory Areas, or TRSAs for short. They surround a Class Delta airport, and what they do is they provide air traffic control services to both IFR and participating VFR aircraft flying in and out of these areas. The way that we're able to identify it is a TRSA, it's always going to be this solid black line or shaded line that basically surrounds it. And we can see that for this airport right here, this is a Class Delta airport, and it's surface to 3,100. But the inner ring here is from surface to 8,000, which is part of the TRSA, and the outer ring is from 2,500 to 8,000. So you're not required to participate, although it's highly encouraged for VFR pilots. And in order to participate, you just need a transponder with a two-way radio of some type. And then the same rules for the Class Delta are going to apply. There's no specific weather requirements within here. It's just there's still airspace that surrounds it. This is just an area that if you ask for basically different air traffic control services as a VFR pilot, you're guaranteed to get those services. Okay. Usually, if you're just flying around outside of a TRSA or a Class Bravo or Class Charlie airport and you want to get flight following or local air advisories, which are very common for VFR pilots, it's going to be on a workload permitting basis for VFR pilots. Okay, if you do it within a TRSA, within a Class Bravo, within a Class Charlie, you're going to be guaranteed to get those services, just because that's what the service level agreement basically allows. Okay. The next one that we have for special use airspace, this is actually starting with the special use airspace. This is the prohibited areas. Prohibited is very simple. It's a prohibited area. You're not allowed to fly in it at any point in time. You will always see a P in the front as basically the prefix, and then we'll have a number associated with it. The number basically allows you to look up, if you wanted to contact whoever owns the prohibited area, you could look up P205 in this, and this is established for basically security reasons or other reasons associated with national welfare. So you want to stay well clear of these and try to allow a couple miles for navigation purposes. I wouldn't necessarily try to sneak between two prohibited areas there. But remember, prohibited is not allowed to be flown within. Restricted areas are going to separate civilian traffic from potentially hazardous military activities. Restricted areas can be identified by basically this blue comb, and the comb, basically everything within this area for this one is restricted 6402 alpha. We could actually look up 6402 alpha, and I'll show you how to do that when we come back from break here, and we could see the hours of operation and who would we contact. Now, you do have the ability to fly through a restricted area, but you need permission from the controlling agency. And by using that restricted, that R6402 alpha, we could figure out who is the controller that's responsible for that restricted area, and we can make that request. Now, 98, 99% of the time, you have the ability to ask permission, but 98, 99% of the time, you're not going to be able to get permission to cross that restricted area. It just depends on what's going on. So VFR flight is allowed through a restricted area, but only if you have the permission of the controlling agency. Okay. Other than that, it's pretty much not allowed. The next one we have is called the warning area. Warning areas are going to be off the coast of the United States, either off of the Pacific or the Atlantic coast. These are going to extend 3 nautical miles off the coast. They're going to warn pilots of potentially hazardous activities from the surface up to 10,000 feet. The warning areas also have that blue comb. The comb side is basically where it's located. So here, everything within this box here is warning area 453 Alpha and Bravo. And everything on this one is basically warning area Whiskey 155 Alpha. We know it's a warning area because it has the prefix of W. You have the ability to fly through a warning area, although you always want to check to see if it's active or not. But even if you don't want to check, you can still fly through it. Okay. Right above that, you got to be careful because here's a restricted area 2908. So we can't fly through this area up here to the north unless we have permission, once again, from whoever is the controlling agency. In some of the busier parts of the country, so I think there's one up in California here, these are called alert areas. These are going to have a high volume of pilot training or unusual type of aerial activity, usually associated with some type of Air Force base. This has a purple or magenta comb associated with it, so everything within this comb here, this is alert area, and it always starts with an A, so that's the prefix Alpha 632 Alpha. You have the ability to fly through. You don't need to contact anyone, but just remember, anytime you're flying through an alert area, you want to be very vigilant and keep your eyeballs outside and always scanning for traffic, just because of the fact that it is traditionally a lot busier than just anywhere outside of it. Military operations areas, these are called MOAs for short. They're also surrounded by a magenta or purple comb. This is the Falls 1 MOA, so basically everything within this geographic area is the Falls 1 MOA. This is established to basically allow military training activities. Now, you have the ability to fly through a MOA. You don't need to contact anybody, but be advised to use extreme caution if you are flying in a MOA, and it's always advised to contact the controlling agency to see if the MOA is active, if it's hot, or if it's cold. Even if it is active and it's hot, you can still fly there. Just use extreme caution if you do so. MOAs are basically the same thing as a warning area. Warning areas are off the coast of the United States. MOAs are basically inland. They're usually going to be surrounded by restricted areas or very close to military bases of some type. Okay, so those are there for you as well. Then we have military training routes. These are called MTRs. So MTRs are going to be listed as either a VR route. These are all VR routes. These are basically visual routes that we can see here. And it will either have a three numbers, or it'll have 4 numbers after it. So typically any of the routes that we have, if you have a military training route with 4 numbers, that means that it's going to be a high-speed route at 1,500 feet AGL, above ground level or below. So these are basically very low altitude, high speed routes. And then anything with 3 numbers after it is going to be above 1,500 feet AGL. Like I said, VR is your visual route. The other one is IR, which is the instrument route for them. So keep in mind that they don't have to abide by speed limitations, and it's not encouraged to follow VR routes for navigation purposes or to basically do so for long periods of time. There's no one to contact, whether they're basically active or not. You can cross them. It's just not wise to basically follow them as routing. All right. All right. Last couple of questions, then we'll wrap up this section here. So under what condition, if any, may pilots fly through a restricted area? Is it going to be A, when flying on airways with an air traffic control clearance, B, with the controlling agency's authorization, or C, regulations just don't allow it? First couple answers rolling in. All right, there's the first 40% of the class. I've got I think one more question after this, and then we'll take that 10-minute break. We got about 75% of the class in. And on a few stragglers. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at this one. We got 3% with A, 79-ish, almost 80% with B, and about 16-ish% with C. So keep in mind that if we're talking about a restricted area, you can fly through a restricted area as long as you have permission from the controlling agency, or in this case, with the controlling agency's authorization, okay? For the one that regulations don't allow, that is the prohibited area. That usually starts with a P, so don't fly through prohibited areas. All right, the next FAA test question that I've got for you is dealing with MOAs, and then we're pretty much on break here. So which action should a pilot take when operating under VFR in a military operation area, also known as a MOA? Is it A, obtain clearance from the controlling agency prior to entering the MOA, B, operate only on the airways that traverse the MOA, or C, exercise extreme caution when military activity is being conducted? All right, Kathy, I'll give you a few extra seconds there. If you're unable to access the poll, go ahead and hit F5. F5 will refresh the page for you. If you're on you're obviously on a computer system. If you're on a mobile device, just go ahead and just refresh the browser, or basically just enter the whatever the site address is again. About 50%. All right, there's about 80%. Guys, a few extra seconds here. All right, hopefully that's enough time to get everybody in. Let's take a look at it. We got 23% with A, 5% with B, and over 71% with C. So if we're talking about a MOA, very simply, you have the ability to fly through it. You just need to exercise extreme caution when military activity is being basically occurring. The last thing that I'll show you real quick here is how to actually look up a restricted area or anything else. So if we were to look on skyvector.com, we've got Edwards Air Force Base, which is this class Delta right here. And then surrounding the Edwards Air Force Base is the restricted area. This is restricted 2515, 2515. So what you would do is you'd basically unfold your chart and basically go to the very, very top here. And let me just turn off these layers so they're not interrupting us. These are all TFRs. And at the very, very top here, what you'd see is there's a section called Special Use Airspace on the sectional chart. And very simply, if you forget what they stand for, P for prohibited, restricted, warning, alert, MOA, etc., what we would look for is we would try to find 2515. So we've got our number off the left-hand side. Looks like it's going to be on the next column here. And here is 2515. I'm going to put it at the very bottom here. So for Edwards Air Force Base, it is unlimited, basically surface all the way up to infinity. It is continuous 24/7. If we wanted to figure out could we potentially go within the restricted airspace, we would contact Joshua Control, and the frequency would be 120.25, or we could try 133.65. So you'll notice that some of them are 24 hours a day, some of them are only certain times of the day, but that's how we look up the information. If I wanted to look up different MOAs, the MOAs are color coded with basically the same color that you'd find on the chart. And if I wanted to maybe go into the Able Bravo MOA, we could see that it's at 7,000. It's from 5:0500 to 2200 Monday through Friday. So you could basically check with them the Yuma, basically Yuma approach here or departure, and it's 124.15. Now remember, to fly into a mower, you do not need permission. It's just wise to figure out if it's active or not. Some of them are only going to be active with a NOTAM. A NOTAM is called a Notice to Airmen, and we'll tell you a little bit more about those on Friday. All right. So with that, what we're going to do is we're going to take that 10-minute break. Thanks again for your patience so we can close that up. That is all in local time on those charts. The NOTAMs will be in Zulu time. So go ahead and stretch your legs, grab a bite to eat, recaffeinate, rebeerinate, rebourbonate, whatever your drink of choice is. And when we come back, we're going to push on to federal aviation regulations. We'll see everybody back in a few. right, everybody, welcome back from break. Hopefully you had a chance to stretch your legs and grab a bite to eat or something to drink. The last thing I'll show you guys, I didn't have this in my PowerPoint, so I was running to the other computer. This is kind of my tricks, I guess, for airspace identification. If you kind of look at it, everything on the left is that nice cyan color, that bluish color, and everything on the right is the magenta purplish color. So if you can kind of separate these out and just realize that there's only two colors, you either have a dashed line, or you have a solid line, or you have a shade. And that's really going to make life a lot easier when it comes to just kind of figuring out how to identify each one of the different types of airspace. So I will have someone post this in the Facebook group, and I'll have someone post it on the news feed as well. So if you guys want to download this, but this is all taken, directly from the legend. And if you guys can kind of think about it, there's really only two different colors and five different potential either solid line, dash line, or a shade. It'll make things a lot easier when you're basically trying to learn how to identify the airspace. And then there's always dead giveaways. Class Delta has the box with a number in it. Class Bravo is always going to say who owns the Class Bravo. So in this case, Las Vegas Class Bravo. Same thing with Class Charlie. It's always going to say who owns the Class Charlie. This is Burbank Class Charlie. So these are just some examples and things that I can kind of give you guys, but we'll post that a little bit later today as well. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to move on to our Federal Aviation Regulations so we can get back on schedule here. Now with the Federal Aviation Regulations, that is known as your FARs. So I'll show you guys exactly what that looks like. Now the Federal Aviation Regulations, obviously to get the most up-to-date and accurate information, you always go to the government website. There are a lot of books out there. So this is a book printed by ASA. There's a ton of companies that print these. Basically, they take the government regulations and they basically print them. Now, obviously, anytime something becomes printed, the government regulations are obviously adjusted far more frequently. So this is already outdated by the time it's printed, even though it's 2022. So with these books, you'll usually see them as a FAR AIM. These are the ones that we're also giving away. So anybody like Michael, who just purchased lifetime access up there, you guys will potentially get a copy of this depending on what Travis draws. The Federal Aviation Regulations is really the first part of the book, and then the second part of the book is called the AIM. We're going to get into the AIM on Friday. We'll talk more about what the back of the book has. The regulations are really designed in terms of they're really for pilots in this book. They also have a version for mechanics. They have another version for airline pilots. So it's just kind of like the best regulations or the different parts of the regulation that's going to be most applicable to whatever group they're basically talking to. Okay, so you don't need this, by the way. A lot of people have these by the time they get their check rides. But at the end of the day, you can always look these up online, and we're going to go through them anyways in detail moving forward. So when it comes to the Federal Aviation Regulations, as I said before, these are known as your FARs, F-A-Rs. And there's three different areas that we're going to be looking at. Just keep in mind that there's a lot of other different parts. They're always going to start off with 14 CFRs, so it's basically 14 Code of Federal Regulations. 14 is just the part that basically aeronautics such as NASA and the FAA and I think someone else basically lives within. So what we're going to be looking at are part 1, which is our definitions and abbreviations. This is going to contain all of the most commonly used terms in aviation, and we're only going to go through a very small sprinkling of these, okay? So there are hundreds of different terms and things that they outline within that section. You're more than welcome to take a look at them. Part 61 is going to be your certification for pilots and instructors. This is basically, how the FAA is telling us how do you get a pilot's license, whether it's a sport pilot or a private pilot, commercial, or anything else in between. It also tells you basically how to get your flight instructor certificates and ratings, the condition of issuance, and then what you can do and what you can't do, which is known as privileges and limitations of those certificates and ratings. Now, we're obviously not going to go through all of Part 61. We're going to touch on your student pilot license and what you can and cannot do as a student pilot. You're a bit more restricted. And then once you become a private pilot, what can you do and what can you not do as well? Then we're going to spend the bulk of our time basically covering Part 91, which is your general operating and flight rules. And this is a large section. So what you'll see is that we're going to cover specifically most of the VFR rules that are out there. And this is going to describe basically what you can and cannot do if you're going to be operating an aircraft within the United States. So just like a lot of things in life, unfortunately, aviation has quite a bit of rules, and a lot of times they were written down by lawyers, which means that they don't always say what they mean, or at least the way that you might understand them to be read. So there's a couple that are very, very easy to read, and then there's some that are a little bit more roundabout when we get to that. So starting off at the beginning, we'll start with part 1, which is going to be our definitions and abbreviations. So we'll take these one by one here. So the first thing we need to know is just an aircraft. And an aircraft, most of the time people think of an aircraft as just an airplane, like the one that has wings with a couple engines on it. And an aircraft is really defined as anything that flies. And for the purpose of your certification as a pilot, there is a term that we like to use called a category of aircraft. We're going to use category and class. The first one is a category. And categories of aircraft mean that it represents an aircraft that is something flyable having similar operating characteristics. Now, as of today, there's 7 categories. Airplane, which is what most of you folks are going to be looking at in terms of getting licensed for. There's also glider, rotorcraft for our helicopter folks out there, lighter than air. We have powered lift, powered parachute, and weight shift control. So your license is going to say the category. Most of you, like I said, will say airplane, and then it will have a class after that. So looking at your pilot certificate, assuming you guys all signed up on IACRA, like we said the first day, and got your student pilot license, you'll have your name and address and information there, and it will basically say student pilot with whatever your certificate number is. That will basically be the most simplistic license that you'll get. Now, as you kind of progress through the system and you get your private pilot's license, it will say private pilot on the front, and on the back, it's going to say what are you basically allowed to fly. So the category in this case is you're certified for airplanes, and you can only fly single engine land. So this is called the category, and the one back here is called the class, and we'll talk more about the classes. So the other one we want to look at is going to be the definition of a class. So also for the purposes of pilot certification, you will have broken into aircraft 4 basically classes. So you can either be single engine land, single engine sea, multi-engine land, or multi-engine sea. You're going to have one of those, and then obviously if you end up getting additional check rides and additional licenses, you'll have more than that listed on your actual pilot certificate. So just because you get a airplane single engine land does not mean you can jump into a helicopter. It does not necessarily mean you can jump into a balloon or a glider. You have to make sure that you're licensed appropriately. So very simply, what we've got here is if we look at the bottom right one, this is a pretty simple one. This is just an airplane single engine land. So in this case, you cannot fly a multi-engine aircraft. You can't fly a seaplane with a single engine or a multi-engine. If you start kind of adding in your licenses, what we have here is this individual has airplane single and multi-engine land. They have rotorcraft, helicopter, lighter than air, airship, glider, powered lift. So they have basically all of the different categories and multiple different classes within the actual aircraft. Okay. The other one that we also want to be aware of is something known as make and model. And the make and model really only applies to you as a student pilot. Throughout your student pilot career, you're going to get a number of different endorsements, which is basically something very similar to what we're giving you here at the end of your training. So once you guys pass this training and you're ready to take your knowledge exam, you guys will see an endorsement that looks something like this. But it's basically going to say, I certified John Doe has received the required training in a specific what. And this is what we mean by make and model. Now, normally you are not restricted to make and model. You're actually just not restricted, period, to make and model once you are a licensed pilot, meaning that you actually have a private pilot certificate. We do not say that as a private pilot you can only fly a Cessna or a Piper or a Cirrus. You can basically fly anything within that realm as long as it fits within the category and class. So the make and model could be something like an A36 Beechcraft Bonanza, a Cessna 152, a 172, a Piper Malibu. And like I said, you are going to be limited as a student pilot to any specific make and model which is endorsed by your flight instructor. Anytime that you're given an endorsement, you have to follow the endorsement in terms of whatever the instructor actually writes on there. And then once you guys are licensed pilots, you're not going to be restricted to a specific make and model. All right, so your first question, and we're going to go through a lot of test questions here today, so let's see if we can do these fairly quickly. With respect to certification of airmen, which is a class of aircraft? Is it A, is it going to be airplane, rotorcraft, glider, lighter than air? B, single engine land and sea, multi-engine land and sea, or C, lighter than air, airship, hot air balloon, and gas balloon? Nefris, we will get into that here in just a few minutes. So that is going to be endorsements. That is going to be endorsements. Please answer in the poll. All right, there's about 50% of the class. Blimp hours, that's an interesting one. That I'm not sure where you get blimp hours from. I'm sure you could probably Google it. I doubt that there's a lot of blimp schools in the United States. You're probably going to be limited, Andrew. All right, you got about 70% of the class in climbing here. A and C seem the same, but you'll notice that there's a few extras that are added in there. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at it. Apologize if I cut anybody off. We have to do these a little bit quicker because we have so many questions tonight, but we got 36% with A, 61% with B, and just a couple people with C. Very simply, this is saying with respect to the certification of airmen, which is a class, right? So remember, it's always category and class. And everything on line 1 is actually going to be a category, right? So if we switch this and said which is a category of aircraft, or basically a category of aircraft, yeah, same thing, it would be A, but that's not going to be the case. A class of aircraft is actually going to be B with the majority of the class that got this correctly. It's going to be your single engine land and sea, multi-engine land and sea. And C is incorrect because of the fact that some of these are not going to be, these are non-existent categories, right? So hot air balloon, gas balloon are not actually categories of aircraft when we looked at the 7 categories that we initially talked about. All right, good job, everybody. All right, some other definitions that we need to know that we talked briefly about is going to be VFR and IFR. So VFR is your visual flight rules, and really the whole premise of VFR is to see and avoid other traffic, not to do what this individual is. 90% of your attention when you're flying needs to be outside those windows, looking around, making sure that you are clear of other traffic. And then 10% is really looking inside to verify that the aircraft is doing what you think it's doing. So are you actually in a climb or a descent? Are you holding straight level? Are you holding your altitude? So by doing this, we talked about this in our last lesson. We basically have a specific in-flight visibility that we have to maintain depending on the airspace that we're flying in. And we have a minimum distance either above, below, or horizontally from any cloud formation. So we're not actually allowed to fly into the clouds whatsoever. And the whole purpose of VFR is that you should be able to fly that aircraft solely by reference, visual reference that is, to the horizon or the surface of the Earth. On the flip side of that, if you go on beyond your private pilot training, you could get an instrument license, or basically the reason why that class that we have for the IFR class, the instrument class, is learning all about the new regulations and the things that we have to know as instrument pilots to fly in these types of situations. So IFR is instrument flight rules. It is a subpart, basically a certain section within your Part 91. We're not going to talk about it in this class, but that is your instrument training. And then once you get your instrument rating, you can basically fly under IFR flight rules or conditions. So within this, you have the ability to fly basically through the clouds and also in reduced flight conditions. We fly different approaches to get back into the airport. And primarily what we're doing is we are flying the aircraft solely by reference to the flight instruments instead of looking outside. So air traffic control is going to use all their radar and services to basically provide separation between all aircraft operating under instrument flight rules. And then if you're in the clouds, you can't see other aircraft. So basically it defaults to ATC to act as your eyes in basically within those circumstances. That would be your next step if you're interested in basically putting more tools in your toolkit. The last one we need to look at, actually second last one we need to look at, is the definition of night. It seems very obvious that, when it's dark, that's considered night, but nighttime is officially defined as the time between the end of evening civil twilight and the beginning of morning civil twilight, and this is published in the American Air Almanac. So very simply, anytime we're dealing with regulations that are going to be talking specifically about hours of darkness, it is going to be referring from sunset to sunrise. If we're dealing with the term night or nighttime, and it's specifically used, then we actually refer to what you see at the beginning, which is the time between the end of evening civil twilight and the beginning of morning civil twilight. So usually this is when the sun set, but it's still a little bit, there's still some light, residual light in the sky, or same thing in the morning. Usually the way that this works is if sunset was around 6 p.m. local time, it would not officially be night until about 30 minutes after. So that would be roughly around 6:30 p.m. And that's basically when the sun, 30 minutes after the sun has set, or 30 minutes prior to the sun actually rising. And you can look up the official time. It's roughly 30 minutes, but it changes every day based upon the American Air Almanac. And the reason why we're going to look at this is we're going to look at something called currency. There's certain things that we have to do to maintain our nighttime currency in order to continue flying at night. And we have to do a certain amount of takeoff and landings, and it's got to be done at night. So we'll look at how that is defined moving forward. All right, so very simply, the next one that we've got is going to be the definition of nighttime. So it is either going to be A, from sunset to sunrise, B, 1 hour after sunset to 1 hour before sunrise, or C, time between the end of evening civil twilight and the beginning of morning civil twilight. Tomas, please answer in the vote function. We've got about 50% of the class in so far. Laura, if you're looking for things to tab, we're going to go through all these different regulations. You can tab the ones that we're actually running through in real time with the class. Arthur, any reason they refer to civil twilight, not nautical twilight? That I'd have to research. Maybe Travis has an answer on that since he was Coast Guard, but we use civil twilight. And the American Air Almanac, for any history buffs out there, it's basically an almanac that tells you not only sunset and sunrise times, but it also has basically rising times of the moon and the position of the moon, Jupiter, and a number of other planets. So this was a book that was used for celestial navigation with a sextant that used to be taught, and it's actually kind of been phased out. All right, looks like we got everybody in here. We've got about 92% with C and just a couple of people on A and B there. So the definition of nighttime or night, remember it could be either or, is going to be the time between the end of evening civil twilight and the beginning of morning civil twilight. So great job, everyone. All right, and our final definition that we need to look at is all of you folks out there, which is known as PIC, or pilot in command. This is the individual that has the final authority to basically the responsibility for the operation and the safety of the flight. So there's always going to be a pilot in command that's been designated before or during the flight. You can switch off places if they are they hold an appropriate category, class, and type rating if applicable or appropriate to conduct the flight. So even in the airlines, there's usually a captain and a first officer. The captain is kind of the default pilot in command. Now, obviously, if the captain passes out, then the first officer becomes the pilot in command as a default. When you guys are flying with your instructor will be pilot in command, regardless of how many hours you have. But then once you guys are either working on your solos, if you're flying by yourself, you will be pilot in command. Or if you're going to be flying with other licensed pilots, you'll have to designate who is PIC and who is not. Just remember, at the end of the day, the FAA is going to be looking for the PIC in the event there's any type of violation, accident, or unhappy event. And no matter what the category of class of the aircraft is, there's only one legal pilot in command at any particular instance of a flight. Okay? All right. That's it for part one. So those are our big definitions that we need to get. If you guys are interested in basically researching further definitions, they're located in there, but kind of unnecessary. Part 61 is all of the paperwork in terms of how to get our license, the administrative record keeping, and so forth. So this is going to be our next section that we're going to look at. We're going to start off with basically our required documents, our medical information. We'll move on to student pilot, and then we'll look at what can you do and not do as a licensed pilot, as a private pilot. All right, so very first one, you'll notice in the upper left-hand corner, for those that are wanting to flag their FAR aims, if you've got it in front of you, I am going to include the actual number. So this is part 61, or basically 61.3 is the regulation. You guys can always read through the actual legalese if you want to, but we're going to try to boil it down to something a bit simpler. Okay. All right. So you are required to have 3 documents in your possession at all times if you're going to be operating as pilot in command or a required flight crew member. Very simply, the first one is going to be a valid government issued ID. It does have to be valid. Could be driver's license, government, any government ID, whether it's military or your passport or passport card. You also need to have your student pilot license or your pilot's license with you, and your medical certificate as well. These are things that have to be readily in your possession, so they could be located in your flight bag or basically your wallet. Can't leave them in the car, just in the event you get ramp checked. So there is a fourth thing that you are required to also carry, so this only applies for student pilots. So basically, for the purpose of a student pilot, you are also required to carry your logbook with you. The logbook has all the endorsements, basically what we've signed off as instructors on your behalf. So if your instructor has signed off to allow you to solo, this is basically your permission slip that you're going to need to carry with you. Once you're done and you become a licensed pilot, that is a private pilot, then you can actually leave your logbook at home. You don't need to carry it with you anymore. At any point in time, you could be asked to present these 3 documents or potentially 4 documents if you're a student pilot to any federal aviation administrator, usually a safety inspector, any member from the National Transportation Safety Board or the TSA, and also any representative from federal, state, or local law enforcement. And basically, we call these ramp checks. It rarely happens, but it does potentially happen as well. Okay. I do not know what the punishment is if you leave it in your car. They might give you a violation. Who knows? All right, so moving on to the next question here. A recreational or private pilot acting as a pilot in command or in any other capacity as a required flight crew member must have in their personal possession or readily accessible in the aircraft a current A, logbook endorsement to show that a flight review has been satisfactorily accomplished, B, medical certificate if required and an appropriate pilot certificate, or C, endorsement on the pilot certificate to show that a flight review has been satisfactorily accomplished. Kevin, yep, that was McLovin from that movie. Got the movie name already. Electronic logbooks such as ForeFlight or paper logbooks, Arthur, do count, and you always keep a logbook for any of the hours that you need for the purposes of training or currency. So remember that you do not need to have your logbook with you once you're a licensed pilot. You just need to carry that logbook as a student pilot. Great, got about almost half the class in so far. Yep, Superbad was the name of the movie. All right, about 60%. Waiting a few stragglers here. There's 75%. All right, Paul, I apologize if I'm going to cut off anyone here. I'll have a few more people in their answer. I'll give you guys another couple seconds, actually. Reading is fundamental when you guys look at these questions. So very simply, I'm going to go ahead and end it right there. We had about 83% of the class with B, a couple people on A and C there. But very simply, just figure out this is a licensed pilot, recreational private pilot, okay? And then what do they actually have to have in their personal possession, right? So correct answer is B. It's a medical certificate if required and an appropriate pilot certificate. A and C are both incorrect just because it says a logbook endorsement to show that a flight review has been satisfactorily accomplished. You're not required to carry your logbook with you if you're a licensed pilot. And C is also incorrect because it says an endorsement on the pilot certificate to show that a flight review has been accomplished. Once again, you don't have to prove that either. So you only carry your logbook with you if you are if you are a student pilot. That is it. Once you're done and you get your ticket, as a private pilot, sport pilot, recreational pilot, then you can keep it at home and you're safe wherever you want to keep it. All right, moving on, we're going to look at alcohol and drugs. This is 61.15. So very simply, alcohol and drugs do not mix in the world of aviation. We actually have a couple rules out there. It's 8 hours bottle to throttle is the way that we remember it. So basically from the time that you had your last drink, you have to wait a minimum of 8 hours before you get into an airplane. And this is going to apply if you are acting in the capacity of a pilot in command or a required flight crew member. You've got to wait the 8 hours after consuming any amount of alcohol. The other thing as well is that you cannot act as a pilot in command or a required flight crew member if you have a blood alcohol content of 0.04%. So it's got to be less than 0.04%, and that is half the legal limit of the United States, basically the driving limit of 0.08. Okay. Consider also that there are some cold and cough medicines out there. Now, you should not really be flying if you have any, type of flu or sinus infection, but for whatever reason, if you are taking Dayquil, NyQuil, any of these others, they have a significant amount of alcohol in there as part of the cough suppressant there. So if you're not careful and you don't dose correctly, you could actually wind up with a high blood alcohol content that will, put you in trouble as well. The other thing I'll also mention is you cannot fly with anybody visibly intoxicated. You can't fly with a visibly intoxicated friend or passenger unless they're under direct medical supervision or it's some type of emergency. Now, the regulations within this section also require that any type of drug or alcohol motor vehicle action, if you're pulled over for a DUI or anything along those lines, you have to actually report that to the FAA within 60 days. Otherwise, if you fail to do so, they have the ability to actually suspend your certificate or just revoke your certificate or rating and also potentially deny any new application for certificate or rating up to 1 year from the date of the motor vehicle action. Okay. So 8 hours bottle throttle, less than 0.04% is the numbers that you want to think about. All right, your duration of medical certifications. This is 6123. So generally speaking, the greater the passenger carrying responsibility you have, the more stringent the medical exam. So remember, at minimum, you guys need a third class medical. And obviously a second class is for commercial purposes and a first class is if you want to work for the airlines. The important thing to remember is that for the terms of medical certificates and a lot of things that we're going to be talking about, it's going to be calculated within calendar months. So what that means is the clock starts ticking on the first day of the month after the month in which you get your exam. So if you obtain your medical in January, the monthly count starts the following month or February. Basically, you get that free month. So preferably do it at the beginning of the month and you get basically an extra 30 days built in. Okay. For the most part, your duration, the only thing that you need to know for a pilot, for a private pilot that is going to be the duration of a third class medical. And that's the only one we're going to be talking about in this class. And very simply, it's based upon your age, unfortunately. So if anyone here is over 40 years of age, basically 40 years or greater, then yours is going to be valid for 24 calendar months. Okay. If you are under 40, then it is valid for a wonderful 60 calendar months. So it's basically roughly 2 years if you're over 40 and up to 5 years if you're under 40. Now, if anybody here is like 39 and about to turn 40, go get your third class medical so that way you can lock in the 60 calendar months. You'll still be good there. Okay. Basic med and those types of things, that does not apply for people who do not have medicals. You have the ability to get basic med, which is another type of medical as well, assuming that you have held any type of first, second, or third class medical. Basic med is pretty simple. Basically what ends up happening is you're going to go ahead and fill out basically a medical documentation and take a class online. And then what will end up happening is you can go and see your local primary care physician. They will fill out the documentation for the FAA. You'll go ahead and mail that to the FAA, and then you're basically operating using basic med based upon your driver's license, that is. And you basically have to do some continuing education classes, and you still have to see your primary care physician to do rechecks periodically as well. Now with basic med, you can't use it for commercial purposes. There's also some other limitations, such as the aircraft can't be greater than 6,000 pounds. You're limited in, obviously staying outside of Class Alpha airspace. So the max altitude you could fly is 17,999, and some other limitations as well. But you cannot get basic med unless you have held at least a first, second, or third class medical prior to that. Okay. All right, let's go ahead and move on and look at the next FAA test question. Try to cut out things. Some of these test questions are lengthy, so keep in mind when you're reading the poll, it says ... because I ran out of space. A third class medical certificate was issued to a 19-year-old pilot on August 10th of this year. To exercise the privileges of a recreational or private pilot certificate, the medical certificate will expire at midnight on that August 10th, 2 years later, August 31st, 5 years later, or August 31st, 2 years later. This is where reading comes in. Just pull out the key parts of this, whatever the question is asking for. I got about 70% of the class in. About 90% of the class in. All right, so taking a look at this one, we've got a few people with A and C here, and we've got the majority of the class, 91% of the class with the correct answer, which is B. So very simply, the pieces that we need to basically pull out of this is we're talking about a third class medical certificate for someone less than 30, and it was issued on August 10th. Everything else we can basically ditch out of this question here. So some of these get a bit wordy. So remember, anybody with a third class medical who's less than 40 is basically valid for 60 calendar months, which is the equivalent of approximately 5 years later. So that's how we come up with August 31st, end of the month, 5 years later from whatever the current date is. If this individual, if we basically changed this question and we basically said, hey, this person is 41 years old, then C would be the correct answer because it's 2 years later, which is approximately, it's 24 calendar months, which is approximately 2 years. So there's a number of different ways that they could potentially ask you this question. All right, moving on, 61.31. These are what we call type ratings and additional training. So just because you have a pilot's license that says airplane single engine land, there are certain types of aircraft and different types of things where you need additional training in order to fly whatever that aircraft happens to be. So the ones that we're going to be looking at specifically are going to be for high performance airplanes, complex airplanes, pressurized airplanes capable of operating at high altitudes, and tailwheel airplanes as well. Now the way that this training works is it's a single time training, meaning that you get, or I'm not going to say single time training, a one-time endorsement. So you're going to do whatever the training is, and whenever you're proficient and you meet the requirements, the instructor is going to sign you off with a one-time endorsement. And for example, once you have high performance airplane endorsement, you're good to fly whatever airplane single engine land high performance aircraft there are out there. So it's only something that applies, once you do the training with the instructor, you're all set basically for life. Now, for some of you that have flown in these types of aircraft prior to when the law was introduced, most of these, or this regulation was introduced, most of these were introduced in the 90s. If you flew, for example, a high performance airplane prior to 93, you're basically grandfathered in. For everybody else here, which I assume is 99.9% of us, we would have to go get the additional training with an instructor. And you do need to know what each type of, what is a high performance airplane, what is a complex airplane, etc. The other one that you may need in the near future is if you want to act as a pilot in command, you might need a type rating. And a type rating is going to be required for any aircraft that has a maximum gross weight of greater than 12,500 pounds, is a turbine powered aircraft, usually a turbojet or turboprop powered aircraft. And then there's a couple aircraft out there that are specified by the FAA administrator, but the main number that you want to kind of commit to memory is 12,500 pounds. So even if you get your multi-engine rating, you can't just hop in a Gulfstream like a G5 like this. You actually need to go and do additional type rating work, and you'll get a specific type rating for that aircraft moving forward. So let's look at each one of these. The first one is called a high performance aircraft. This is within the same regulations. A high performance aircraft is going to be defined as an airplane having more than 200 horsepower. More than 200 horsepower, or what I usually like to say is 201 plus, okay? Does not include 200. You'll notice that anytime, a lot of airplanes will be exactly 200 horsepower, because as soon as 201, if it's 201 greater, it's then classified by the insurance companies as high performance, and then the insurance rates actually go up on it. In order to get your high performance endorsement, you have to have received and logged both ground and flight training in such an airplane from an authorized instructor. And once again, you'll get a one-time endorsement in your logbook certifying that you're proficient to operate a high performance aircraft. And then that will apply to any high performance aircraft that you fly, okay? The next one that we have is called a complex aircraft. A complex aircraft is defined as it needs to have all three. So it needs to have a retractable landing gear, it has to have flaps, and it has to have a controllable pitch prop. Even if it has two of the three, it's not going to qualify. It needs to have all three. If it does not have a controllable pitch prop, or a controllable prop, it could also be replaced with an electronic engine control system, which is also known as a FADEC. Some airplanes do have that. In order to act as a pilot in command of a complex aircraft, you're required to basically finish ground and flight training from an authorized instructor, and you'll once again get a one-time endorsement, and that'll be good to cover any complex aircraft that you do fly. Next one is pressurized aircraft, and pressurized aircraft are aircraft basically that are capable of operating above 25,000 feet MSL, regardless of if you personally are capable of flying up there. So, for example, if we look at this Malibu on the left-hand side, we can see that it's an airplane single-engine land. Now, you have the ability, if you got $1 million burning in your pocket, if you get your pressurized aircraft endorsement, your complex aircraft endorsement, and also your high performance, those are three additional endorsements you'll need in order to fly this aircraft. But it is possible, just with the basic license that you will have. Now, the capability of the aircraft, keep in mind, is above 25,000 feet. So even if you're a private pilot and the max altitude you could fly is 17,999, that is based off of the 25,000 feet is based on the aircraft. So no matter what, even if you have no desire of operating the aircraft above 25,000 feet, if the aircraft is capable of it, then you are going to be required to get the ground training and the flight training from an authorized instructor in that pressurized aircraft. So this is also a one-time endorsement as well, and this is something that does need to be done in person. For example, the the first one that we covered, which is the high performance, that can actually be done on a simulator, although I would encourage you to just do it in the actual high performance airplane. Okay. And the last one that we've got is a tailwheel aircraft. So really the big difference for those that don't know is most of you will probably be flying a tricycle gear, which looks like that, which is fixed. The tail wheel is that little tiny baby wheel at the very bottom there. So if you want to act as a PIC of a tailwheel aircraft, you will also need an additional endorsement on top of that. So you're going to have to basically do some ground and flight training. On average, tailwheels actually takes about 5 to 10 hours to get your tailwheel endorsement. It's one of the longer ones out of the bunch. And the instructor has to find you proficient in the operation of the tailwheel airplane for normal and crosswind takeoff and landings, wheel landings, and also go-around procedures. So this is one that takes a little bit longer to learn. It's also a very good way to really learn your stick and rudder skills, primarily your rudder. You'll have a much greater appreciation of utilizing the rudder if you end up operating a tailwheel. The instructor is also going to give you a one-time endorsement within your logbook, and then you're set for life moving forward. Okay. All right, so a couple questions that are going to relate to the additional endorsements or potentially the type rating. So what is the definition of a high-performance airplane? Is it A, an airplane with an engine of more than 200 horsepower, B, an airplane with 180 horsepower or retractable landing gear, flaps, and a fixed pitch prop, or C, an airplane with a normal cruise speed in excess of 200 knots? Awesome, Dan. Welcome aboard, sir. Got one more test question after that, and then we'll take that 5-minute break coming up here. Got about half the class answered this question so far. All right, got about 75% of the class in with this. If you train in a tail dragger, Pat, you will most likely get an endorsement when it comes to soloing. Same thing if anybody wants to train in a high performance aircraft or complex aircraft, you're going to need the endorsement when you solo anyways. So high altitude pressurized endorsement, you actually have to do it inside the airplane itself. So those airplanes, I've seen it run about $1,000 or $2,000. Caitlin? All right, just waiting on a few stragglers here. We got about 90% of the class in. Looking good on the answer, though. All right, let's take a look at this. Apologize if I cut off anyone. We got 94% of the class with the correct answer, which is A. Couple people on B and C. So we're talking about a high performance aircraft. It is an engine that has greater than 200 horsepower, so 201 plus. Okay. B is completely incorrect. Nothing with 180 horsepower, and we've never talked about anything that deals with a specific airspeed. All right, last question before we take that 5-minute break here is going to be dealing with the type rating. So let's go ahead and pull this one. The pilot in command is required to hold a type rating in which aircraft? Is it A, an aircraft operated under an authorization issued by the administrator, B, an aircraft having a gross weight of more than 12,500 pounds, or C, an aircraft involved in ferry flights, training flights, or test flights? I think someone else was asking how much is the type rating. Depends on the aircraft that you're flying. So, if you end up getting a type rating in, let's say, a 737, those are about 10 grand. Gulfstreams are absolutely ridiculous. I think I've seen them for like 30 to 40,000, depending on which Gulfstream you want. And some of the cheapest ones are like 2,000 or 3,000 for some of the citations out there. But that's like going to school and just learning about all the systems inside the airplane. You usually go into the simulator and you usually have to do, somewhere between 10 and 20 hours, and you actually take another check ride to get a type rating as well. So got about 50% of the class in. You guys have a lot of cats out there, don't you? When we come back from break, we'll go ahead and push on. And the next topic that we're going to cover, just to kind of give you guys a heads up, is called currency. So just because you have a license, then there's certain things you have to do to maintain a license. So think about it like you buy a car, right? And just because you have a license plate does not mean the car is you still have to pay money and stuff to actually operate the car after that, right? You usually have to pay for your registration every single year for the most part. For most states, you also need to, obviously keep up to date with your driver's license every couple years. So there's certain things that we're going to talk about when we come back from break that we have to do in order to maintain, the proficiency that is, and also what we would call our currency in order to legally fly, whether we're flying by ourselves or with passengers. All right, let's take a look at this one. We've got 14% with A, 81% with B, and the balance of the class with C. So the B's have it correct. Remember that magic number, 12,500 pounds. So a type rating is required in order for a pilot to act as pilot in command of a large aircraft, which is further defined as more than 12,500 pounds max certified takeoff weight or a turbojet powered aircraft. Okay. So the reason why A is incorrect, we had a bunch of people say that, it doesn't actually address the weight or the type of propulsion. And C is incorrect because it's also the same thing. It doesn't address the weight or the type of propulsion, which is the main thing that we're looking for. All right, everybody. So with that, go ahead and stretch your legs, and we'll see everybody back here in 5 minutes to continue. right, everybody, welcome back from break. Hopefully you've got enough energy to push on for another 45 minutes or so. A couple questions that I saw. So the endorsement that we provide you does not expire. That's one question that I saw. The other one that I think I saw was, is there any one-on-ones remaining? Yes, I asked Travis. There are 14 remaining. So if you want the lifetime access, now would be the time. So that way you can also get that 1 hour ground as well. So keep in mind that does not expire. All right, so what we're going to do, looking at part 61, this is 6156. So now that you have your license, there are certain things that you need to do every 24 calendar months in order to just get back into the airplane. So this is just for you to fly the airplane by yourself. So every 24 calendar months, you are required to do a flight review. This used to be known as a biannual flight review. And a flight review is pretty simple. It consists of an hour of ground and an hour of flight with an instructor at a minimum. So it just depends on how rusty you are. Your license, your private pilot license, or whatever license, certificates, or ratings you hold never ever expires, but you do have to be current in order to basically utilize them. Now there's two different ways to avoid a flight review. Number one, you could basically participate in the FAA Wings program, which is basically a safety related program. You could take classes like ours. Our class qualifies for Wings credits. You can do a series of seminars, in-person classes, online classes, and then they also have certain flight segments as well. If you get enough credits, then that will basically suffice to replace your flight review. If you have more interest, more specific questions about it, Missy is a rep with them, so she can speak more to that if you do have it, and you can always log in and sign up for the program. I believe it's faasafety.gov. The second way to do it is you can obtain a new certificate and or rating. So for example, every time that you get a new certificate or rating, it resets the clock for another 24 calendar months. It's pretty simple to do the flight reviews, and it doesn't have to be done all at once. You could do the ground first, and you could do the flight separate. Just depends on your schedule. The other thing you need to do is if you want to carry passengers, in order to act as pilot in command carrying passengers, you need to have made at least 3 takeoff and landings within the preceding 90 days as the sole manipulator of the controls in the same category and class of aircraft you intend to fly. They can be any type of landings you want. They can be to a full stop. They can be touch and goes. And you can do a taxi back, whatever you want. The only stipulation is that if you are flying a tailwheel aircraft, all landings have to be made to a full stop. And that's usually when the little baby wheel at the back touches the ground, the tail wheel. Okay. So that's that one. And this is going to be for day. So you have basically 3 different requirements. You're going to have, if you want to fly by yourself, every 24 calendar months, you're going to need to have a flight review. If you want to basically fly with passengers, you need to have 3 takeoff and landings within the preceding 90 days during the day, if you want to carry passengers during the day. And then the last one we have is if you want to carry passengers at night. It's very similar to it. So you need to have had 3 night takeoff and landings within the preceding 90 days as the sole manipulator of the flight controls, but they have to be to a full stop. Once again, it has to be done in the same category and class of aircraft you intend to fly those passengers in, and this is where that night definition comes in handy. So for the purposes of currency, nighttime is really going to be dealing with, it begins 1 hour after sunset, and it ends 1 hour before sunrise. So very simply, if sunset was at 6 p.m. local time, traditionally we would start logging nighttime in our logbook starting at 6:30 p.m. and then it would be at 7 p.m. we could actually do it for currency purposes. Okay, so another way to look at this as well is that if you were not current and you wanted to carry some friends up as passengers later in the evening, or potentially you forgot about it, the latest that you could carry a passenger if you're not current would basically be about 6:59 p.m. That would be your cutoff time, a minute before 7 o'clock in my example. Okay, so that would be the latest point in time. Now your nighttime landings can count for your daytime landings for the purposes of currency, but it does not work vice versa. Your daytime landings do not count for your nighttime landings. Okay, so important to remember that. Now the other question we usually get is, can I carry people with me if I just need to do 3 takeoff and landings? The answer to that is no. Okay, You're not current to carry passengers unless you have the 3 takeoff and landings under your belt when you take off. Okay, so if it's coming up to 7 o'clock and you realize you're not current, you're going to have to go and drop off those passengers. Do your 3 touch and goes, or full stop landings, that is, after 7 p.m. in my example, and then you're current, and then they can all come back into the airplane. Okay, so these are all legal minimums. Keep in mind that just because it's a legal minimum, and here's kind of the summary here for you. Just because it's a legal minimum, it does not necessarily mean you're going to be very proficient at the end of the day. If you did all of your takeoff and landings on January 1st and you didn't fly for 85 plus days, and 3 months later you get into the airplane with your entire family, are you going to be that, good at actually landing that aircraft if you haven't touched the controls in that long? Okay, so very simply, kind of to put it into a summary here, you need to have a flight review in order to fly by yourself every 24 calendar months. That's step number 1. If you want to carry passengers during the daytime, you need 3 takeoff and landings. TO is takeoff and landings within the preceding 90 days. If you want to carry passengers at night, you need the exact same thing, 3 takeoff and landings within the preceding 90 days to a full stop. And it basically has to be using that definition of nighttime, 1 hour after sunset, or 1 hour before sunrise. Your nighttime landings can count for your daytime. Your daytime cannot count for your nighttime. Okay, this is all tracked within our logbook, so that's how we basically can prove whether we're current or not. All right, so looking at your recency of experience, this is the next FAA test question. If recency of experience requirements for night flight are not met and official sunset is at 18:30, the latest time passengers may be carried is at 18:29, 18:59, or 19:29. A full stop landing just means that after you land, you come to a complete stop. You could do that on the runway, and then you could basically go again. Let's see if there's any other questions. I think the moderators are getting them. What happens if you miss a flight review? So basically, if you miss a flight review, you cannot exercise the privileges of your pilot's license. You got to get that flight. You're basically grounded until you get your flight review done. Simple as that. I got about 50% of the class in with this. All right, about 75%. A little bit of a spread here. And logbooks and stuff are primarily based upon the honor system. So, where people get in trouble is if you do get into an accident, an incident, or anything like that, or you get ramp checked and the FAA wants to see your logbook. Obviously, they can tell pretty quickly if you are, lying or anything else with those official records. So nobody is going up to you every single flight and saying, are you current? Do you have your flight review? That is primarily based upon the honor system. About 80% of the class in. If you are current, Scott, and you do any of your landings nighttime or daytime with passengers, they do count. They will count as long as you're current. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at this. We're kind of all over the board here. We got 28% with A, 20% with B, and 40% with C. Very simply, we know that official sunset is at 18:30. So just like I did in the example here, sunset is going to be 18:30. And remember that we can start logging for the purposes of currency exactly 1 hour later. So we could basically log the flight for the night takeoff and landings, and we could actually start logging that at 19:30. So the latest that we can carry passengers is, can't go to 19:30. We can go a minute prior to that. So in that point, basically 59 minutes past sunset, which would basically put us at 1929. Okay, 1929. All right, couple of other easy regulations here. Kind of move forward. The next one is going to be your change of address. This one's pretty simple. So very simply, this is 61.60. You have 30 days to notify the FAA if you have a permanent change of address. Does not include mailing addresses, but any type of permanent address. If 30 days elapse since whatever your address change is, then you basically cannot exercise the privileges unless you advise the FAA of your new address in writing. You can do this online, FAA.gov. They make it pretty simple now. If you go to the main page, somewhere on the right-hand side in the quick links, they give you the information in order to notify them within that time period. Okay. All right, another test question. Hopefully this will be 100%. We'll see here. If a certain certified pilot changes permanent mailing address and fails to notify the FAA Airman Certification Branch of the new address, pilot is entitled to exercise the privileges of the pilot certificate for a period of only, is it A, 30 days after the date of move, B, 60 days after the date of move, or C, 90 days after the date of move? For people like snowbirds and those types of things, whatever your permanent mailing address is, wherever you're going to normally collect the mail, for those that have dual citizenship, once again, this all comes down to whatever your permanent mailing address is. So if you temporarily reside somewhere else, or maybe you're going to college and you live with your parents back home, probably want to use your parents' mailing address. All right, got about 50% of the class in so far. About 80%. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at this one. We got 82% with A, 11% with B, and the balance of the class with C. So for those that were paying attention, correct answer is 30 days. 30 days after the date of whenever you move. So got to notify them within 30 days. Otherwise, you cannot exercise the privileges of whatever license you currently hold. All right. All right, moving on to some of the student pilot regulations. So these are things that are only going to apply for student pilots. Once you guys are a private pilot, you guys can basically disregard this section, but for the moment, it's going to apply. 6187 is your solo requirements for student pilots. So there's a number of things that will basically be done working up to your solo. Basically the 6187 Bravo 1 through, or basically Delta 1 through 15, which is this one. These are all the things that the instructor is going to make sure that you basically have accomplished. If you were to look those up, basically emergency procedures, talking on the radio, basically takeoff landings, normal and crosswind, and a number of other things, including stalls and slow flight. So they're basically checking off all these things prior to you actually being released for solo. It's not just, when the instructor deems you're ready. So that's part of it. The other thing you're going to do prior to your solo is you're going to have to take a pre-solo written test, but unlike the FAA knowledge exam that you guys are working on right now, it's fairly informal. Every flight school and instructor might have a different exam. It's usually going to be 15 to 20 questions, and it's going to basically ask you questions about your specific airplane, your different V speeds, takeoff stall speeds. It's also going to ask you about certain regulations and also airports frequencies and different types of airspace. So if you have that from your flight school, you can probably answer it as we're going through these chapters, but it is completely open book, and then you're going to sit down with your instructor and correct it until it's 100%. And then they're actually going to give you an endorsement, basically stating that you completed the pre-solo written exam. Part of your limitations as a student pilot, number one, you cannot carry any type of passengers. Does not matter, brother, sister, coworker, child, do not bring them on board any of your flights when you're flying by yourself. Your very, very first passenger that you're going to be carrying is actually going to be your your evaluator. Okay, so either a designated pilot examiner or someone from the FAA. That is going to be your very, very first passenger, and that's the day of your check ride. You cannot fly for compensation or hire, nor can you fly for the furtherance of a business. You cannot, if you own a business and you're going to go pick up something for that business or do a meeting for that business, you're not supposed to use one of your solos for that purpose. You can't go and work with the instructor and say, hey, I've got this meeting in Vegas. Can I also make a solo out there? Technically, that's not allowed. Student pilots are not allowed to fly when the flight or surface visibilities are less than 3 statute miles during the day and 5 statute miles at night. So normally it's 3 statute miles day or night. In this case, for night, it's going to be 5 statute miles as well. You also may not fly without visual reference to the surface of the Earth. So as a student pilot, we're not supposed to send you out over a large cloud bank. If it's a solid overcast layer and you can't physically see the ground, then that's not going to be allowed either. Now, obviously, once you're a licensed pilot, you can fly over an overcast layer as much as you want. And then the final thing is that you have to abide by the regulations and any type of limitation that the instructor is going to place in your logbook. So a lot of times in your logbook, what I used to place for students was basically headwind limitations, crosswind limitations. We usually limit you in terms of your home airport and then an extra airport as well that you can fly to. It does not give you a license to fly anywhere and everywhere. In addition to that, for my students in the past, I used to say prior written permission was required. So basically, they would let me know, hey, I want a solo at this time, and I just look at the weather real quick, and it could be as simple as a text message or an email back as the prior written permission. Okay. So the other thing you also need to remember is that as a student pilot, initially when you're doing your solo, you're going to be on a 25 nautical mile leash per se. So whatever your home airport is, let's just call this the ABC airport, it's going to be 25 nautical mile radius that you can basically fly. Anytime you go further than 25 nautical miles, you need to basically have cross-country flight training, which is something that's going to occur with your instructor. And that's anytime you're kind of outside of this bubble, you'll need that cross-country flight training, even though a cross-country is not defined as you have to fly greater than 50 nautical miles with a landing beyond that point. Okay, so those are kind of the main regulations that you kind of want to pay attention to as a student pilot. Your instructor, I'm sure, will remind you of some of these as well. So if you have any questions in terms of where you can go and where you cannot go, a lot of it's going to be limited at first, basically for your safety as well as for the instructors, right? So you guys will get a multitude of different endorsements for each one of these, and eventually when you guys get your cross-country training done and you're doing your solo cross-countries, you'll get a day of endorsement, which basically says that you are good to fly to a certain cross-country to these airport locations and via this route on a specific day, and you've basically... The instructor is basically stating that they have reviewed the weather and also your flight plan to make sure that it's good to go for that day of the flight. There are a little bit of hoops that you have to jump through as well. All right, now it's going to change a bit. So obviously once you're a licensed pilot, in our case, the private pilot, these are things that we can and cannot do. So this is 61113. These you want to kind of commit to memory. These are called your privileges and limitations. So we talked about kind of an overview last Monday on day 1 of kind of what you can do and what you can't do. This is kind of the full, more comprehensive list. So very simply, a private pilot has unlimited solo privileges and may carry passengers and or cargo, as long as this is basically for pleasure or personal business and is not done for hire. So you cannot do it for compensation and or hire. A private pilot may fly in conjunction with his or her job as long as the flying is incidental to your employment. So what that means is, let's say you're flying for an employer, or not flying for an employer, but your employer has a trade show up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and no matter what, you have to go. It does not matter whether you're driving, you're flying Southwest, you're taking the train, you potentially offer, hey, I've got my own airplane. Can you reimburse me for the expenses? So they can reimburse you for the expenses, assuming it's incidental. It's not something that's just for fun to get you up there. There's a couple stipulations within that too, like you can't start carrying other coworkers, can't start carrying like trade show booths and other things for the company, because in that regard, then you're starting to push the boundary of flying for compensation or for hire. Private pilot may not pay less than the pro rata share of the operating expenses of a flight with your passengers. So if you have additional passengers on board, you can actually split the cost, but it has to be done evenly. The expenses could, and they actually only involve the following. So it's fuel, oil, airport expenditures, and or rental fees. So keep that in mind. There are a couple exceptions in which you can actually get reimbursed for the flight. So this is really the only time. So if the only time passengers may pay for an entire flight is if a donation is made by the passengers to a charitable organization which is sponsoring the flight. You can also get reimbursed for the purposes of search and rescue, anything that is directly related to that search and rescue effort. You also have the ability to tow a glider or unpowered ultralight vehicle, and there's some additional regulations that we'll look at there, and basically some additional training that you need to do so. Okay. The next one that we've got is you can also demonstrate an aircraft. So if you're an aircraft salesperson, you need to have 200 hours of flight time under your belt, and then you can actually demonstrate an aircraft to prospective buyers. And some of your limitations, of course, that we talked about is you cannot fly for compensation or hire. You cannot fly in Class Alpha airspace because you need an instrument rating and to be on an IFR flight plan. You cannot fly special VFR at night. Just keep in mind, you need additional licenses, certificates, or ratings in order to do other things. So a commercial pilot can actually fly for compensation or hire. If you wanted to fly on a scheduled commuter operation or airline operation, that is where your airline transport pilot license comes in as well. Okay. So all pilot certificates except the student pilot license are going to be valid indefinitely unless you surrender them, they're superseded, or they are revoked. Okay. Any other questions? I think we got most of the questions there with that. Make sure. Airport expenditures include hangar rental for your airplane, for your plane. So that's where it kind of gets a little bit, Bill's asking that, that's where it kind of gets a little bit dicier, because the question is how do you subdivide out that amount for that specific flight? You could probably figure out how many hours there are in a month and then divide the hours that are within that month with whatever your hangar payment is. And then figure out how many hours you flew. But I know the FAA has a circular on that, so you could always take a look at that. Incidental to your job, but if you fly to a location for a meeting as furtherance of your job, is that allowed? It has to be incidental. So if you have to take that meeting no matter what, then that is basically what we mean incidental to your job. You just can't carry other coworkers. You can't carry other materials. It's basically like transportation. That's all it is. All right, so for those that are interested in towing gliders, once again, this is a privilege that you have, but there's some additional requirements as well. There's only one FAA test question on the test that revolves around this. But you do need to hold at least a private pilot certificate with a category rating for powered aircraft, so airplane single engine land will work. You have to have at least 100 hours of PIC in the aircraft category, class, and type if required that the pilot is using to tow a glider. And you also need a logbook endorsement from an authorized instructor who certifies that the person has received ground and flight training in gliders and is proficient in the following. So you're basically going to review with that instructor the techniques and procedures essential to the safe towing of gliders, including airspeed limitations, emergency procedures, signals used, and maximum bank angles. And then just like we have currency for carrying passengers, you also have experience requirements for the initial sign-off to tow gliders. So for most of us, we're probably in the private pilot world, which means that you need to have 3 actual tows with a glider behind you, and you have to be accompanied by a qualified pilot. If anybody here is a commercial pilot, or maybe once you become a commercial pilot, then they can be simulated tows with an accompanied qualified pilot as well. So those are your restrictions as for basically towing a glider, right? Here's your next FAA test question revolving around privileges and limitations. With what exception, if any, permits a private pilot to act as pilot in command of an aircraft carrying passengers who pay for the flight? Is it A, if the passengers pay all the operating expenses, B, if a donation is made to a charitable organization for the flight, or C, there is no exception? Another question, can two people who are students fly at the same time with an instructor? That is, yes, two people can, but only one of the students is going to be able to get your dual instruction time. An instructor cannot sign off on two students with dual instruction time. They can only supervise one student at a time. But a lot of times students will sit in the back because sometimes there's lessons to be learned because you're really not under all that pressure to perform. And sometimes you can see things a little bit clearer and kind of see how maneuvers are done. So if you have the opportunity to sit in on another student's flight lesson, realize you're not getting any flight time in that capacity, but it is a good, learning opportunity for you. So Larry's asking another question. So if he has a coworker that will be driving my car to my meeting, as long as you're operating it and you're just remember that for those that are talking about all this incidental to your business, when it comes to the privileges and limitations, what you can be reimbursed for is the cost of the flight itself. So let's assume it's a rental aircraft for simplicity's sake. You can get reimbursed for that cost of the rental. You cannot get reimbursed for your time. So you technically can't really be paid for your time while operating that aircraft because then you're flying for hire or compensation. I know it's a bit confusing. Got about 60% of the class in on this one. You can be reimbursed if it's to a charitable organization, but it has to be an IRS recognized 501c3. So just keep that in mind. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at this one. Kind of gave away the answer there. I was trying to go through the questions, but I think I inadvertently gave away the answer. We have only a person or two on A, 84% on B, and the balance of the class with C. So this is an exception if a donation is made to a charitable organization. Just keep in mind it has to be defined by the IRS as a 501, I think it's C3, which is basically registered with the IRS as a charitable organization. So also, it's not going to be C. There's never no exception. So just keep in mind that if you're acting as PIC of an aircraft, and it's used in the passenger carrying airlift per se, is sponsored by a charitable organization, and for which the passengers make a donation to the organization, then that's when you can basically be reimbursed in those circumstances. Okay. All right, moving on. That's basically it for part 61. We're going to get into the beginning of part 91. So part 91 is all of our general operating and flight rules, kind of the how-tos. So a lot of people like to think part 61 is kind of how you get your license. Part 91 is how you lose your license. So keep that in mind, but we'll be a little bit more positive than that. So starting off with the most basic and simple regulation, this is 91.3. This is your pilot in command authority. So very simply, the pilot in command of the aircraft is directly responsible for and has the final authority to the operation and basically the safety of that flight. You as a student pilot, when you guys are soloing or when you get your license, you have the same authority as this KLM captain sitting here in this 747. Now, in the event of an in-flight emergency requiring any type of immediate action, the cool thing about this regulation is that all the other regulations that we're going to be talking about, you can actually deviate from any of those regulations to the extent required to meet whatever that emergency may be. Okay, so this is the one regulation that allows you to basically bypass all others in the event of an emergency. Now, the important thing you want to keep in mind is that any pilot who deviates from a rule may, upon the request of administrator, be required to provide a written report of the deviation. Keep in mind the magic words here, and most people miss this, is that If you deviate from any rule of the part, so if you deviate from any of these rules, it's on request, okay? It's upon the request of the administrator, who happens to be the FAA, okay? They may request a written report of the deviation. Does not necessarily mean that it happens. All right, so let's look at the next FAA test question. One should hopefully be a little bit clearer. If an in-flight emergency requires immediate action, the pilot in command may, is it A, deviate from any rule of Part 91 to the extent required to meet the emergency, but must submit a written report to the administrator within 24 hours, B, deviate from any rule of Part 91 to the extent required to meet that emergency, or C, not deviate from any rule of Part 91 unless prior to the deviation approval is granted from the administrator or by the administrator. The first third of the class in. And we should be able to wrap up everything in about 20 minutes. We'll finish, like I said, we'll finish anything that we don't cover with the Federal Aviation Regulations on Wednesday. We'll just pick up where we left off. If anybody here wants to attempt the quiz, you're more than welcome to. We'll get through about 80% of everything that we need to cover. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at it. We've got 21% of the class with A, 72% of the class with B, and a few people, 5% with C. So the majority of the class, once again, has it. The correct answer is going to be B, and you can deviate from any rule of Part 91 to the extent required to meet that emergency. So I'm glad that folks caught on. You're not required to submit a written report to the administrator unless you're asked. That's basically per request. So we had 21% basically state that. But remember, to go back to what I highlighted, it's upon the request of the administrator. Any pilot who deviates from a rule, which is basically of Part 91 here, may, upon the request of the administrator, or required to provide a written report of the deviation. Okay. All right. 91.7, every single aircraft out there has what is known as a Civil Aircraft Airworthiness Certificate. They look just like what you see on the right-hand side. They're very much akin or very much like a birth certificate of an airplane. So when they roll off the factory line, it will have one of these. The airworthiness certificate never ever expires, but it also does not imply that the airplane is airworthy. We're going to talk more about airworthiness and the different inspections and documents that we have to have probably a little bit more on Wednesday. 91.9 is dealing with all of our flight manuals, markings, and placards. So what you see here is there's 3 different things that we have to pay attention to. On board the aircraft, you're always going to have a copy. Call this number 1, number 2, and number 3. Your number 1 there is basically an airplane flight manual, which is known as an AFM, or a pilot operating handbook, which is known as a POH. You're always going to have a copy on board, and that's also where you're going to find a lot of limitations about your airplane. Number 2 is your placards. So this is everything from your airspeed limits to potentially things like your no smoking sign, the fuel that needs to be put into the aircraft fuel tanks, and a number of other things. And then number 3 would be all of your aircraft and instrument markings. So the voltmeter, we've got red, yellow, and green there. You've got all of your color coding on your airspeed indicator. And there's a number of other color coding on or around your instruments that basically make up your instrument markings. So as a pilot in command, you are actually required by this regulation to comply with all of the operating limitations. So that includes the POH and AFM, any type of instrument markings, and also placards that are found in and around the aircraft. For anybody here that likes to drop things, 91.15 will allow you to do so. So you do have the ability to drop anything you want from the airplane. The main criteria is that the pilot in command may not drop an object in flight if it creates a hazard to persons or property below. Okay. So other than that, if you're clear of people and property, then go nuts. You can drop whatever you want. I've seen sometimes they do like flower bomb drops where people will put out targets, and then whichever airplane gets closest to the drop, you win, basically. 91-103 is pre-flight action. This is an important one. So the mnemonic that we use is on the right-hand side. It's Northwest Craft, and I'll talk about that here in a second. So the regulation states that before you begin any flight, you are required to become familiar with all the available information concerning that flight. This is what we call a catch-all rule. So what you're going to notice is that within the FAA, there's several regulations that basically have, I would call it a catch-all rule, where it's going to tell you to do the minimum, and then somewhere else in the regulation, it's going to say it's your responsibility to make sure you have all the information available. Okay. So the first part here is for a flight that's not in the vicinity of the departure airport, you must check the following. So you have to check weather reports and forecasts, fuel requirements, alternates available if the flight cannot be completed, and any known traffic delays advised by air traffic control. You are also required to check that you're going to use. So very simply, if I'm going to do a local flight, maybe I'm just going to fly from Camarillo to Oxnard, which is about 5 miles away, and I'm really not going anywhere outside of the airport. All I would be required to do is actually just check the runway lengths in the airport for both Camarillo and the Oxnard airport, and I'd be good to go. But if I'm doing more of a cross country, or if I'm doing something that's not in the vicinity, you'll notice that that's kind of an ambiguous term because the FAA doesn't tell us what the vicinity equates to, then I need to check all of these other things. But the reality is at the end of the day, that catch-all rule says that it's my responsibility to become available or familiar with all information concerning that flight. So that would also include weather and everything else. It would behoove you to kind of go through this checklist and use Northwest Craft. So what we usually use is NOTAMs, which we're going to talk about on Friday. That's Notice to Airmen. So that's basically telling us anything about the National Airspace System that's broken or not in its normal operational status. Obviously the weather, I would always be interested, whether it's a local flight or a flight outside of the vicinity of my home base. I want to know whatever the current weather is, and I want to know what the forecasted weather is. We have our known air traffic control delays. This doesn't really apply very much to VFR, but the reason why this is important is if you're going into a major airport like Los Angeles International or San Francisco, they usually have a slotted system, and they can only accept a certain amount of aircraft per hour for takeoffs and landings, arrivals and departures. And if there is a delay, and let's assume we know that there's a 1 hour delay, we need to make sure that we have enough fuel on board to basically sustain or sit up there for an additional hour. Our runway lengths for all airports that we're departing and arriving at. Alternate airports, and this is basically just an alternate if the flight cannot be completed. Our fuel requirements, we're going to talk about those a little bit later, but we have a daytime fuel requirement and a nighttime fuel requirement, and then any of our performance data. So takeoff and landing and also performance data will apply. So if you cover all of these things, then you should be set in terms of the regulations when we're looking at it. All right, so here is your next FAA test question dealing with pre-flight action. Pre-flight action, as required for all flights away from the vicinity of an airport, shall include, is it A, the designation of an alternate airport, B, a study of arrival procedures at airports, heliports of intended use, or C, an alternate course of action if the flight cannot be completed as planned? Missy, are you going to come to the fly-in on Saturday by chance? What can I do to convince you? Got the first third of the class in. All right, we're at about 60%. We'll make it nice and safe for you, Missy. All right, about 90% now. Just waiting on a few stragglers. Just come out for lunch at least. It's Kern is an easy airport to get in and out of, and it's actually not that far from Big Bear. It's like an hour. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at it. Apologize if I cut off anybody. We've got 30% of the class with A. We've got 15% with B and 54% of the class with C. So the C's do have it. So it's an alternate course of action if the flight cannot be completed as planned. Most people are saying A, and the reason why A is incorrect is you do not have to designate an alternate airport. That's actually incorrect. Nor do you actually have to study the arrival procedures at airports, heliports of intended use. Okay, so the correct answer here is C. All right, moving on to 91.105. Anytime that you are basically in your seat, which is basically called a station. So for the most part, you guys are all flying either 2 seats or 4 seats. It's not like you're gonna have the ability to get up during your flight. These are pretty cramped airplanes, but the main thing is that during takeoff, landing, and also en route, as the pilot in command, you shall be in your seat, also known as a station. And then basically anytime that you're in your seat, you're required to have your seatbelt on. And if you have an aircraft that's equipped with a shoulder harness and it does not interfere with your duties, then it must be kept fastened for takeoff and landing. If it does interfere with your duties, some students have shorter arms and they have problems either reaching the flap handle at the bottom or some of the controls there, then obviously you do not need to wear it for takeoff and landing. Now, the other component is everybody always wants to know, like, why do flight attendants do all these briefings? Now it's your wonderful job to do the same thing. So at a minimum, 91.107 is going to basically tell you that as pilot in command, prior to takeoff, it is your responsibility to brief each passenger on how to fasten and unfasten their seatbelt and shoulder harness. Now, a lot of times there's a little bit more to that. So what I like to include in here is going to be a passenger safety briefing using the safety acronym. I believe we have a copy of this up in the documents beneath this live stream. So this is an FAA recommendation where you use that acronym, and very simply, you want to go over a little bit more than just safety belts and seat belts and those types of things. So you'd obviously want to talk about the seat belts because that's a requirement. When do you actually need to have them on? When do you need your shoulder harness on? It's also good to talk about the seat position. How do you adjust it? Where are your air vents located? How do you turn them on or off, or any type of environmental controls? What to do if there's any type of passenger discomfort. A lot of times people get air sick. F is for your fire extinguisher. How do you actually use and where do you find the fire extinguisher? Where is it located? Most of the time it's between the passenger and pilot seat. Your E is for exits. How do you actually operate the doors? Where are you going to find your emergency exits? What's the evacuation plan? Always tell them to go backwards, away from the prop. Do you have any emergency or survival equipment on board? And any other equipment that you want to make them aware of. T is traffic. So, obviously traffic and talking are big ones. We want to basically maintain what is known as sterile cockpit. So sterile cockpit is basically no unnecessary communication during our critical phases of flight. So takeoff and landing are our primary ones. I'll say taxi, takeoff, and landing. And you don't want to have side conversations while you're trying to take off or look for traffic, or conversations about an upcoming barbecue at that point in time. Traffic is the same thing. So how can they help you see other aircraft? Some people are like eagles with this stuff. They can see traffic 10 miles away, and other people can't see it until it's a mile away from you. And then any questions they may have as well. So this is something that I used to give to students, and they used to carry this on their check rides, and they would also practice this when we were flying, and they would basically just kind of keep this on a spare sheet of paper, or basically save it digitally. And this comes directly from the FAA safety team as well. All right, so at a minimum, what is our obligation here? I'm going to open up the test question. With respect to passengers, what obligation, if any, does a pilot in command have concerning the use of safety belts? Is it A, the pilot in command must instruct the passengers to keep their safety belts fastened for the entire flight? B, the pilot in command must brief the passengers on the use of safety belts and notify them to fasten their safety belts during taxi, takeoff, and landing? Or C, the pilot in command has no obligation in regard to passenger use of the safety belts? The test button, the vote button is open. Lindell, if you're not seeing it, just hit F5 to refresh the screen, and it should pop up right beneath the chat. Assuming that you're not full screen, by the way. I got about 5 more slides to cover, and then we are done. So should get out of here about 10 minutes past the hour. For our East Coasters, if you need to drop off, completely understand. But we'll go for about 10 more minutes, everybody. And got a little bit more than 50% of the class in. All right, about 70%. Last thing that we're going to cover this evening in these last 7 or 8 minutes is going to be what is called right-of-way rules. So very similar to when you guys drive a car. There's always one vehicle that has a right-of-way over another. So we're going to look at those circumstances as it relates to aviation. All right, I'm going to go ahead and cut it right there. I apologize if you are unable to answer. Just take a mental note of whatever that potential answer is or write it down on a piece of paper. But we've got 13% with A and about 87% with B and just 1% on C. So the B's do have it when we're talking about passengers and our obligations as pilot in command as it relates to the safety belts. Very simply, the pilot in command must brief the passengers on the use of safety belts and notify them to fasten their safety belts during taxi, takeoff, and landing. Those are our requirements. All right, and lastly for tonight, real quickly, we're going to go over our right-of-way rules and also operating near other aircraft. So 91.111, 111. You do have the ability to do formation flights, so that's something we're actually going to be doing on Saturday with a couple people. So the main thing is that if you're going to be doing a formation flight like this, you obviously need to have prior arrangement. You can't just join up another airplane that has no clue what you're doing and do a formation. You have to have prior arrangement with each and every pilot in command of those aircraft. And then finally, no person may operate an aircraft so close to another aircraft as to create a collision hazard. Okay, so you need to give enough distance and at least have enough wherewithal to know what's going on. And a lot of times when we do these types of formation flights, we're on a discrete code, or not a discrete code, but a discrete frequency for air-to-air communication so everybody can communicate with each other in this process. All right, so here are your right-of-way rules. For all of you in the United States here, traditionally what ends up happening is if 2 cars come to a 4-way stop, at least in the state of California, it's supposed to be the car on the right has the right of way. As we all know, at least in California as well, that's not always the case. It's usually who got there first. It's kind of the same way with airplanes as well. The aircraft on the right is going to have the right of way over the aircraft on the left. So the whole premise at the end of the day is the see and avoid concept under the visual flight rules or VFR flight rules. And to make this a lot of stuff like complicated, if you kind of look at the entire regulation of 91.113, it's really your responsibility. So in the event that there was some type of in-flight collision, then it's really the FAA is going to come down and say that it was a failure to see and avoid. Okay. So very simply, if we look at these, aircraft B has the right of way over aircraft A because it's to the right of A. Aircraft C is to the right of D, so aircraft C has the right of way over aircraft D. Okay. And this is primarily going to be if aircraft are converging at the same altitude. So this is the same slide. I wanted to actually show you this one. We look at this, the aircraft over here has the right away over the aircraft. That's, as if you're looking at it from the passenger side here, because they are to the right of the aircraft that you're currently sitting in. Now, anytime that we have aircraft that are converging or very, very close to converging head on, very simply, both aircraft are to make a right-hand turn. Everybody is going to make a right-hand turn. So that way we all know, this isn't a game of chicken. In the event something like this happens, just go ahead and make a right-hand turn. The aircraft is going to make a right-hand turn. The helicopter is going to make a right-hand turn. So that way they can pass well clear of each other. In the event you're overtaking an aircraft that happens to be a bit slower, you're also always going to pass on the right. Keep in mind that when you overtake another aircraft, this is not the freeway where you overtake someone and then cut them off within 5 inches. Make sure that you give enough distance, traditionally somewhere between a quarter, sometimes a half a mile. I've seen people do a mile away, because if this red aircraft doesn't see you and they decide to make a right-hand turn and they're not necessarily paying attention or looking, if you're too close, then that could also lead to a collision as well. Moving on, we have the right-of-way rules. The easiest way to kind of think about these is this acronym ABIG-R. Okay, ABIG-R, and it's always in this order. Aircraft in distress, so basically emergency aircraft of any type, have the right-of-way over all aircraft. After that, it is the least maneuverable aircraft, which is the balloons. So balloons just go up or down, and then basically wherever the wind takes them, so they have the right-of-way over all aircraft. Then it's gliders, airship, airplanes, and rotorcraft. Now, a couple things to keep in mind is that an aircraft towing or refueling other aircraft has the right-of-way over all other engine-driven aircraft. And then these rules that we're talking about are going to apply regardless of if you're operating under the instrument flight rules or VFR flight rules. And then vigilance shall be maintained by each person operating an aircraft so as to see and avoid other aircraft. No matter what, it's always see and avoid. That's our number one rule. And that's the reason why your eyeballs need to be outside the cockpit more so than inside. Now, when you're coming into land, the right-of-way rules change just a little bit. In this case, if we look at both of these or all three of these aircraft, assuming that aircraft B has already landed and is getting off the runway here, it's not very clear from this image, then what you have is airplane A has the right of way because they're more committed to land than aircraft C, which happens to be crop dusting next to the runway. Okay. Now, during a landing, if we have two aircraft that are basically in a position to land, we can see here that aircraft B is in a position and they are more committed to land than aircraft A. So aircraft B has the right of way over aircraft A, and they cannot use that rule where they can basically go to the left and cut off that aircraft. That does not work in this situation when we're coming into land. Okay, so look at our final FAA test question of the night. And we are done, everybody. So let me go ahead and open this one up. When two or more aircraft are approaching an airport for the purpose of landing, the right-of-way belongs to the aircraft that, is it A, has the other aircraft to its right, B, that is least maneuverable, or C, at the lower altitude, but it shall not take advantage of this rule to cut in front of or overtake another. Robert on YouTube, good to see you back in class. Same thing with buttons and gadget and buttons, one of the two. Got about a third of the class in so far. So back to Nathan's question, he's basically saying aircraft towing or refueling other aircraft have the right of way over all other powered aircraft. Does that exclude aircraft in distress? Aircraft in distress always has the right of way over all aircraft, no matter what. They are in their emergency situations, so they can kind of do whatever they need to do. Silliest thing while flying? That's a hard one. I'd have to think about that one. All right, about 90% in, just waiting for a few stragglers here. For those that are trying to fill out IACRA, like Lindsay, you're looking for the student pilot application. All right, I'm going to cut it. May have cut someone off. We got 5% with A, 9% with B, 85% with the correct answer, which is C, at the lower altitude, but it shall not. All right, everybody, so that basically wraps up everything that we wanted to cover for today's class. As we kind of push on, remember, if you want to take or basically attempt today's lesson quiz, you're more than welcome to take that college try. If you want to wait until we basically wrap up the rest of the material, you can always wait until we get to that point. So it's not going to hurt you if you take the lesson quiz in 2 days from now. Not a big deal. In addition to that, we're also going to try something new just for this week. So with the Q&A, the Q&As are, because I have a class right after this, we're going to attempt to do the Q&As basically using the moderators and also our tech team. So if you have any questions, feel free to just throw them in the chat. And we're just going to see if this can increase the efficiency a little. We're going to do a little bit of a test over the next couple days and see if this works or not. But other than that, if you have any questions that we weren't able to answer in the meantime, remember, if it's aviation related, you have the Facebook group, which is a great opportunity. Very, very easy to find a quick answer there. You have Ask a CFI, which is on our website. Remember, when you log in, you can basically throw in a question. It's like a discussion forum. You can also see the hundreds of questions that students have basically submitted and we've answered. We typically check those, and I review those 2 to 3 times a day. In addition to that, if you have a technical question, I know Travis and the tech team is going to remain on as well with you. If there's something that they weren't able to answer, you might need to open up a technical help, or basically a help desk ticket, that is. Remember, in the lower right-hand corner of your screen, there's that little yellow headset. Just click on that, and you can click on Submit a Ticket to start that process. Just be as specific as possible. So with that, I hope you guys are enjoying the classes so far. What we'll do here is I am going to go ahead and sign off and prepare for my next class. Moderators and the IT team is going to stick around and answer any last-minute questions that you have. We'll keep the chat open, making sure everybody's questions are answered. And I will see everybody in about a day and a half, 2 days for our next lesson. Take care, everyone. Stay safe, and we'll see you later.